Yeah, fear not the end of history, fear not the misery. Yeah, a quarter century of living end of history. Congratulations, the capitalist mentality has proved itself victorious. Ain't that what they say? All these former communists now in disarray. Is the best that we can do, neoliberal? It appears to me the situation's critical. Throw human solidarity right out the window. No more internationalism, now the xenophobes. Outright racists got control unsurpassed. Cause the Senate couldn't hold, but see now in fact, the so-called democratic way of life isn't that. Not under capital, it means that Marx is coming back. They hope he never rises again from his grave. But as long as exploitation's order of the day, it means that the only solution still remains the overthrow of this barbarism that's the reign. They tore it down, put up the red flag. Can't you see the time is now? Marx is coming back. No doubt, hold this communist liable. Bring it on, it's a red flag revival. They tore it down, put up the red flag. Can't you see the time is now? Marx is coming back. No doubt, hold this communist liable. Bring it on, it's a red flag revival. Yeah, we're doing this in the spirit of the communards who died in Paris trying to bring forward Karl Marx. They held the power behind barricades for 2 months till the state mowed them down. Still, I got a hunch that the new era.
Hey everybody, how's it going, boys and girls, those who bounce in between? It's Comrade Dankey, and I am pleased to be joined by our good friend and comrade on this channel, FVK 1917.
Hey comrades, good to be back.
So, a Vosh fan by the name of Man on the Wall reached out to me on Twitter, and I noticed he had a YouTube page, and so I went and I checked out one of his videos. This one's called Libertarian Socialism with Authoritarian Characteristics. Let's see. I will pull it up for us here, and we can just take a look at it and sort of give our responses to it. So without further ado, let's stop wasting time. Let's get started.
Free politics and whatever else I feel like. Hi, welcome to my channel. My name is Man on the Wall. I talk about history, politics, and whatever else I feel like that day. Before I begin today's video, I'd like to address two things. First off, I'd like to thank everyone who watched my first two videos. You guys have given me an opportunity to reach out into the world in a way I never have before, and for that, I am beyond grateful. Secondly, as far as how I'm going to structure the release of these videos, from now on, I'm going to release one video every Tuesday. Again, thank you all so much. So initially this week, I was going to do a video about right-wing apologists for the Chilean military dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet. I'll still be doing that video, but I'm going to push it back a week so I can address a recent video by Marxist-Leninist YouTuber Hakim. I always knew I was going to have to do a video on this guy, but I didn't know which one I was going to do. It was either going to be the Hong Kong protesters video or the left anti-communism one. But this most recent video of his, quote-unquote, libertarian socialism with authoritarian characteristics, released just a few days ago, is the one I ultimately decided to tackle. Hakim is an interesting figure within the broader tanky community. He's not a raving lunatic like Jason Unruh.
Ooh. All right, so already the mudslinging begins. For those of you just tuning in, we've actually got Jason Unruh in the chat, and we've also got Man on the Wall in the chat, so that's a little bit awkward, I wonder how Jason Unruh feels to being called the Gavin McInnes of the left. It's I was wondering.
It's an interesting figure in the tanky community. He's not a raving lunatic like Jason Unruh, a dishonest grifter like Caleb Mopin, an idiot like Dankey Kang, or a Abaphile like Finnish Bolshevik.
Ooh, all right. So, I mean, I don't know. Are there any comments that you have so far, FVK?
Well, I mean, you know how these things go. I do know on one hand, you guys, you, Comrade Dankey, and Man on the Wall, you guys have a debate this Sunday. So I'm sure you guys will be like principled and all that, but it goes a certain way when you're just doing your own thing or whatever. But I guess we'll see where this video goes. Hopefully it doesn't stay just like this or anything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. We just saw him insult Jason Unruh, Caleb Mopin, myself. but he also goes after Hakeem, which, you know, I think is particularly in poor taste considering that he's from Iraq. He's from a country that, you know, America's bombing right now.
Right. Well, I'll say this. I mean, like, just the fact that you're doing a critique of somebody's video kind of implies that you heavily disagree. So it's kind of just unnecessary at that point to do any type of mudslinging.
Right.
This is what I ultimately decided to tackle. Hakeem is an interesting figure within the broader Dankey community. He's not a raving lunatic like Jason Unruh, a dishonest grifter like Caleb Maupin, an idiot like Dankey Kang, or a habophile like Finnish Bolshevik.
So, you know, I wanted to talk a little bit about this because, you know, this is the first that I heard about Finnish Bolsheviks, you know, escapades on his Discord page. And, you know, I criticized Vosh for having scummy stuff on his Discord page, sexual harassment and whatnot. And, you know, I have to be consistent. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, I am just now hearing about this. And I do think it is premature on my part to come out with any sort of harsh judgment. I mean, this is, you know, I'm not going to defend it. But what I will say is that Finn Bull is much less a leftist personality online and more of a teacher. Think about more of like a Michael from Vsauce instead of a Jake Paul. The content of his videos hinges much less on memeing and e-drama and debates and more on education. So I'd say as far as the educational content of his channel, it's still perfectly good. I mean, now, before anybody calls me a hypocrite, I know I criticize Vosh for sexual harassment on Discord and for his stances on the age of consent and child porn. Now, I'm not aware of any social media posts by Finnish Bolshevik defending child porn or lowering the age of consent, but that's not to say I don't find these actions condemnable. I mean, allegedly, and this is just allegedly, you know, Finn Bull role played as an NKVD officer abusing and raping a prisoner on a Discord server with an underage girl. Again, you know, I didn't know about this, and I feel like there's a lot more to unpack here beyond the scope of this video. So for the sake of brevity, we'll move on. Unless there's anything you want to say, FEK.
I agree. I'm equally as ignorant to this subject, so I'll pass.
His image is much more clean, that of a respectful, well-spoken ML video essayist. If Unruh is the Gavin McInnes of the Dankey left, Maupin the Shapiro, Dankey King the Crowder, and Finnish Bolshevik the Yiannopoulos, Hakeem is the Peterson.
Okay. Yeah, I got a little bit confused with the timestamps. This is the part where he says that, you know, Jason Unruh is like Gavin McInnes, Caleb Maupin is like Ben Shapiro. I'm like Steven Crowder, apparently. And Hakeem, poor Hakeem, he's compared to Jordan Peterson, the greenest philosopher of our age. Let's see. Jason wants to be added to the stream. I'll do that. Bear with me, ladies and gents, just a sec.
Hey, Comrade Dankey, I can get the link to Comrade Jason.
Oh, okay.
I don't know where to send it though, so.
I'm just hitting up on
Twitter.
Yeah, on Twitter real quick.
Okay.
All I can say is hop aboard and get ready for a shit show. Hey, it's the legend.
Sorry, my Discord closed here.
Please, by all means, explain why I'm a ranting lunatic.
Right. Like, I don't know if this is just me, but based off of my interactions with Vosh fans, that seems to be the only argument they have to make against us is like, oh, you're an idiot. You're a lunatic. You're crazy. You're an unhinged, crazy lunatic Dankey. They don't really substantiate why. And, you know, I think it's pretty insulting to compare you to Gavin McInnes, you know, the founder of the Proud Boys. You know, last I checked, you're not you're not a
that's actually dishonest.
Yeah, I mean,
Ranting lunatic.
geez Louise, you want to talk about poisoning the well?
So,
What?
Yeah.
example of me being a raving lunatic?
Right.
Yeah, he doesn't provide anything in this video, but I saw somebody in the comments said about imagine defending Vosh and then like saying Finbull has some questionable history. So
Hey, you know what?
ignore the
You know
thorn
what?
in your
Enough
own
of this
eye.
fucking bullshit. I know that. I know that whole fucking Finbull story.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I know it. You want to hear what this is?
Oh, definitely.
Okay. First of all, girl was not underage. She was age of consent where he lives. It's different than the age of consent in the United States.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, that's the thing because I know her. She was not underage. This bullshit against Finbull was a complete fabrication. Now, I don't know if this role-playing thing is real or not, but that's besides the point. Hey, if you want to role-play fucked up shit, that's
Right.
That's your business. If you want to criticize that and you want to waste your life on that, go ahead. But this idea that she was underage is a complete lie. And I noticed that a lot of this came from sock accounts that were mysteriously linked and also not linked, but also a member of an Arcopax Discord. I wonder if that was a coincidence as well.
I don't know. Like, I'm just noticing.
Because
Like,
I just want to say this thing first. This hole in the wall asshole, I could tear him apart in a debate. I would slaughter him and then drink his fucking blood on stream.
maybe you should take my place.
Anytime he wants to try. But what is this nonsense about me being a raving lunatic? I'm like one of the more calmer heads.
I don't know. You did just threaten to drink his blood.
I didn't threaten to drink his blood. I can metaphorically, I could do that in a debate. That's how good I am.
I know.
And I welcome him to step up and try.
I know. I mean,
I don't fucking back down. I'll fucking take anybody.
And I mean, I'll just preface this by saying, like, I'm set to debate him this Sunday, but you're free. You're free to have at it after that.
I think it's kind of funny calling me a ranting lunatic when Vosh is the one that completely goes off to the point where he even forgets that he's even in public.
I know. Like, how many times has Vosh said very questionable things that you would say are the ravings of a lunatic?
Yeah, when you're on stream that long, I mean, I can't really. Well, I mean, I can blame you, but like anybody who's just sitting in front of the computer that long on camera, you're gonna say something dumb eventually. So, like, yeah.
Or maybe he's just dumb.
So let's see. It gets much worse. I mean, so. Secondly, he calls Caleb Maupin a dishonest grifter and compares him to Ben Shapiro. And Ben Shapiro, of course, he's a person who said that Palestinians like to bomb stuff and live in open sewage. So, I don't know if he's trying to compare like the extremism of these people, the reactionary tendencies of these people, and try to draw some kind of like parallel.
Okay, you know what? I'm going to have to jump in here again. I would massively disagree with Caleb Maupin on numerous issues, but I believe he believes what he's saying.
Right.
I wouldn't call him a liar. I wouldn't call him a grifter. I would say that he's wrong on some things, but I wouldn't call him a liar and a grifter. I'm sorry, but this video right here is, as far as we've seen into it, is complete and utter nonsense.
Oh man, we are just scratching the surface. Trust me. It gets much worse. We're about to enter Radlib light speed here, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah, I'm anti-racist, but shut up, darky, about the Iraq invasion. Basically. That's basically what it's gonna be.
Yeah.
Okay, you know what? I've said my piece and I'm gonna leave because I'm probably going to ruin your stream.
No, you're good, dude.
No worries, comrades. Good chatting with you, though.
Yeah, feel free to come back on at any time.
Sorry, but this is your thing, and I don't want to ruin it. So.
Nah, you're good, dude.
Okay, I'll see you guys later.
Yep, catch you later, comrade.
And there you go, a cameo from the Jason Unruh.
The man of the hour, ladies and gentlemen. So anyway, let's just keep moving on. But actually, before we move on, I want to really address the Steven Crowder comparison. I mean, maybe he's equating Steven Crowder's harassment of, Carlos Meza, other gay people, with my frequent critiques of Vosh that some have misconstrued as harassment, but to that I say, are you fucking kidding me? I mean, I urge all of my viewers and Vosh fans too, go through my playlist and see what I have to say about Vosh and tell me again if anything I said constitutes harassment or anything on the same level as Crowder's real harassment of the gay community. I mean, I know I make a lot of videos about Vosh. The reason I do this is because he continues to masquerade as a socialist while slandering actual socialists to his mass audience of rad lib morons. So, I mean, I don't know. Am I supposed to just sit idly by and allow this dude to continue slandering communists and calling us Nazis? I mean, never mind how he acts like a total man-child. He cowardly slinks out of debating me. But Vosh considers himself to be the face of online socialism. And as long as he is, and others like him, continue to make videos slandering tankies, communists, I'll be there to defend it. The only reason that I give Vosh the time of day at all is because he has enough influence online to do real harm to the left-wing movement in the United States. And his arguments or stances, that all that is to say his arguments and stances aren't very unique, except for perhaps his stance on child porn. But all that's to say, Vosh is someone who deserves criticism. And why shouldn't I be the one to provide it? I don't know.
Yeah, if you're gonna condemn another leftist and compare him to a figure, like you were saying, racist figures and such, I would hope that it's on the ground because they're being racist or something like that, or being right wing or such. But when you're just saying, oh, they're even if your critique is they're authoritarian, but because of that, they're just as bad as racist. I'm not going to put those things in the two category. I mean, totally different things, but I don't know. Let's not compare apples and oranges and such.
Right.
A pseudo-intellectual who cloaks his bad ideas in nice language and a level of restraint lacking in many of his peers. To his credit, he does seem to be a bit smarter and better at framing his arguments than most other tankies online. Unlike a lot of tankies who bash Breadtube as astroturf neoliberals because they don't wait on hand and foot for daddy Xi Jinping.
Okay, so let's address this. He basically says tankies bash Breadtube as astroturf neoliberals because they don't wait hand and foot on daddy Xi Jinping. And let's ignore the fact that I also post all of my videos to Breadtube too. I've tried and succeeded in converting many Breadtubers towards Marxism-Leninism. Let's also ignore that nearly every communist you encounter has disagreements or criticisms of the PRC, whether it's Deng Xiaoping's liberal reforms, Mao's ultra tendencies, or Xi's social credit system, etc. We can have disagreements about a socialist market economy or some other policy without completely changing sides and backing Western calls for regime change, as in the case of the Hong Kong protest, and regurgitating Western lies about a Uyghur genocide that isn't happening. This is the difference between us and Breadtube. And I should specify, not all Breadtubers are like this, ladies and gents. I'm only talking about big-name personalities like Vosh and Xanderthal, etc. I'm fully aware that many Breadtubers out there, such as Non-Compete, have been very friendly towards Marxist-Leninists and are actually comrades focused on building the movement.
And I would add that I think it's funny that he's saying, of course, all tankies just want to wait on Daddy Xi, but obviously that's one of the most divisive topics amongst our community is China.
Right.
But what we generally do, even though those of us who don't agree with China on certain things or whatever, or don't think they're socialist, generally, even folks like Jason, they'll call out the U.S. when they're funding, these color revolutions like the Hong Kong protests and such. So, even though we have different views on China, we can still at least get our community to be united around the idea of not letting the Western imperialists just take advantage of this country just because some of us disagree with them. But so they just kind of lump us all together because we're not willing to go along with that narrative. And they think it has to be that you're just like in love with Daddy G or something if you say, well, the Western imperialists are, this Uyghur thing is kind of ridiculous and like stuff like that. So kind of how it goes.
Yeah, and then I don't know. It just sort of when he said that we criticize Breadtube calling it AstroTurf neoliberalism. I mean, let's talk about why we say that kind of thing. They constantly make videos calling communist authoritarians. They call us fascists and Nazis, racists, Holocaust deniers, etc. And this serves to reinforce the neoliberal end of history paradigm where all alternative forms of government to Western capitalism are lumped into this broad category of authoritarianism, whether it be from the right as in fascism or the left as in communism. This horseshoe theory bullshit only reinforces bourgeois anti-communist Red Scare hysteria and perpetuates it in leftist spaces. And these are the same people who cry about left unity when they slander other leftists as Nazis and fascists. And I mean, they also frequently support Western-backed color revolutions, such as the anti-communist Hong Kong protests or the attempted coup in Belarus. Some even went so far as to condemn Evo Morales in Bolivia and Maduro in Venezuela. All of this serves to push the left into compliance with the left in the U.S. into compliance with the objectives of imperialism, toppling socialist or socialist-leaning governments around the world and replacing them with pro-Western puppet states. Of course, I've been ignoring the elephant in the room here. Man in the Wall, at least according to his Twitter, is a social democrat, and therefore he isn't even supportive of ending capitalist exploitation and imperialism. So it makes sense for a social democrat to repeat pro-Western propaganda slandering actually existing socialism.
Yeah, and since we got G on the screen, before we continue with this video, I'm going to butcher this quote, but what is it he said? You're only as good as your policies, how they end up, or something like that. But it's kind of the same way of thinking. It's like, it doesn't matter what your intentions are if you want an equaler society or whatever. If your actions are geared towards helping regime change in other countries and such like that, your intentions, no matter how moral you think they are, doesn't like create that same type of reality. So yeah, that's the biggest issue there.
Yeah, it's definitely a problem. And we also have another problem in the chat. There's a Nazbol. So
yeah, I messaged you about that. Let's purge.
Who is it? Is it Nazbol Jedi?
Yeah.
All right. You gone, buddy. To the gulag with you. So
there we go. But yeah, do you want to continue the video there?
Oh yeah.
Hakeem seems to be trying to build a fitting onto the
you can't see it on the screen.
Those people become Marxist-Leninists.
That's true. Thanks for reminding me.
And it seems to be more fitting onto the Breadtube pipeline in order to convince some of those people to become Marxist-Leninists. And it seems to be working for him. If one looks at his most popular YouTube videos, for example, you'll find a lot of stuff fairly prototypical of the broader Breadtube space. An attack on race realism, criticisms of Jordan Peterson, criticisms of PJW, criticisms of capitalism, the kind of thing you wouldn't find too out of place on ContraPoints' or Sean's channel. But if you look deeper, you'll find the ML and Soviet apologia he engages in much more frequently. It's an intelligent strategy to be sure, but you still haven't fooled me yet, buddy. Make no mistake, despite his more respectable presentation, Hakeem is just as much of a reactionary, authoritarian apologist as an Unruh, a Moppin, or a Dankey Kang.
Wow. Okay. So it's funny that he refers to me as, a reactionary.
Hey, I just had to interject. Sorry there, Comrade Dankey. I know I see people are saying, oh, well, he uses the name ironically. Like, okay, like whatever. I mean, that's not really. I mean, do your thing or whatever. But I mean, that's not really funny or whatever. So yeah, goodbye. But they were talking about the Nazbol dude. They
Oh,
said it was like, ironic, but like I don't know,
if
whatever.
it was ironic, that's fine. You know, feel free to, you know, I don't know how to unblock you, but feel free to come back on a sock account or something like that. You know, I've had some Nazbols in my chat in the past, and they usually just stir up shit, and so I ban them on sight, as you should to any fascist. But I mean, it's weird. So, Man on the Wall refers to me in this clip as a reactionary, as an authoritarian apologist. And so, you know, I want the audience now, I want you to ask yourself, does this person believe capitalism is authoritarian? Since he's a social democrat, the answer is probably no, but I don't want to put words into his mouth. And what about the irony of a social democrat calling a communist a reactionary? In what way exactly? I support the liberation of the working class, and he doesn't. So if anything, he's the reactionary.
Yeah, yeah. He could go anywhere with that. Like, I want to see like what kind of context he gives, because that's obviously wacky.
Unfortunately, he doesn't give any context.
Oh, well, there you go, guys.
He just leaves it at that. He calls me an idiot. He calls me a reactionary. Doesn't explain why. Just says, "All right, argument, you know, is settled. It's settled. I won."
It is. All right, I just got to say, yeah. I mean, I don't want to give these people too much credit, but I mean, like just using Marxist words, which are based in like a class analysis, and just throwing them around because you think somebody's not as moral as you, is just kind of cringy.
Right. But anyway, let's keep on going, because it gets much worse.
So without further ado, let's take a look at his video. A quick side note before we begin. I've watched quite a few of Hakim's videos, and he tends to use the same few reels of footage on repeat withaut much variation. Granted, most of my videos consist of me talking over an avatar I made in Windows Paint in 10 minutes that sometimes changes eye movements, so maybe I don't really have a leg to stand on in this case.
Hi there. Interesting things are going on in the US currently, and more or less worldwide to a lesser extent. As it pertains to the leftist movement generally, though, there's something unsavory that comes up in practically every discussion on theory and tactics. Sadly, a minority of the conversation taking place currently. Talk about socialism, the necessity of revolution, learning from our history, etc., and you'll eventually come across the supposed libertarian-authoritarian divide. You see this nonsense everywhere, on that silly political compass you find online, and if you've been bad this Christmas, then in organizing spaces too. Let me put your mind at ease. This is a meaningless divide. It doesn't materially exist.
Really? You know, there's a part of me that's literally just tempted to post Kronstadt meme.
Okay, so I think before we start talking about Kronstadt over here, you know, let's talk about, he says the libertarian authoritarian divide doesn't materially exist. You know, the strange thing is that you know, this person, he brings up our history, cites our history. You know, is Man in the Wall a social democrat, or is he an anarchist? I mean, for the sake of this video, I'll assume, like a lot of Breadtubers, Man in the Wall identifies as a social democrat but has anarchist sympathies. But I don't know. Maybe he would like to clarify if he's still in the chat. But yeah, let's keep
Until
going.
the end of time in place of an actual argument. But I mean, do I need to explain why this isn't true? All you need to do is look at our history of everything from the Black Army, the Tambov Rebellion, the Kronstadt Mutiny, the fact that the Cheka, the precursor to the NBKD, targeted left-wing dissidents far more than right-wing counter-revolutionaries, the Spanish Civil War. Yeah, I don't think the divide between authoritarian and libertarian socialists is as insignificant as you claim.
All right. I mean, so I think it would be a good idea for us to talk about like each of these events in the future. We can make a video talking about the Black Army, a video talking about the Tambov Rebellion, about Kronstadt, and about the Spanish Civil War. Because I think there's just a bit too much to unpack here for this video. But Man in the Wall says, because of these events, the divide between libertarian and authoritarian socialism exists. And I feel like this is a misunderstanding of what Hakim's trying to say. When he said that they don't, when libertarian and authoritarian doesn't materially exist, he meant that from a materialist view, we can see the divide between the left, which is anti-capitalist and pro-worker, and the right, which is capitalist and anti-worker. This divide is well understood and objectively verifiable by observing the material conditions of the society in question. But words like authoritarian or libertarian have no materialist conception. You can't say that communism, you can say that communism is authoritarian, but you can easily make that same claim against capitalism. And we can see how in the case of American quote unquote libertarianism, how it embraces the most authoritarian economic model conceivable, shrinking democratic institutions down to the size of a pea while expanding corporate power. The so-called libertarian ideology is the most authoritarian one of the bunch. And, let me ask you this. If communism is authoritarian, it must be significantly less authoritarian than capitalist countries. This is why the whole libertarian authoritarian paradigm is so bad, because it takes the objective divide between the left and right and obscures it behind metaphysical arguments about liberty and authority.
Yes, and it ultimately it conflicts with, like, as Marxists, it conflicts with our view of like what authoritarian would mean. And interestingly enough, it is similar to the anarchist point of view. Like, we believe that all states are authoritarian. Like, it's going to be the rule of one class over another. There's going to be authoritarianism there. Otherwise, why would the state exist at all? So, to just say, oh, well, it's more authoritarian than the other one. It's like, wait, but I thought, we at least agree on that all states are authoritarian. But, you're right. His ultimate beef is that he's saying, like, if you look at their history, libertarian socialism, he's saying that they take a more moral route. And by looking at our history, it's just so obvious that we're just so much more authoritarian and evil than them. So that's the divide. But, the argument that we always make is that ultimately these anarchists, when they're faced with a revolution, they're going to see their material conditions. They're going to see tons of reactionaries in their state. They're going to see pressure from other imperialist countries. And they're going to have to make decisions on the spot about what are we going to do about these issues if we're going to survive. Because if they don't, they're going to crumble. So, look, I mean, that doesn't give you, like, free reign to just say, well, when I'm my socialist state, that just gives me free reign to, like, just rule over everybody and be super evil or whatever. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that at least we can anticipate that we're going to have these type of issues, and we can strategically plan about, well, what will happen, and how should we treat, reactionary workers when they try and fight against our state or whatever. But I just wanted to read a quote here, and I want you guys to guess who this is from, because I know it is kind of confusing. He's a social democrat, but like a lot of Breadtubers, he kind of pulls from, like, anarchist history. But so here's this quote here I'm about to read. So it goes, "The weeds must be torn out by their roots. There cannot be and must not be pity for the enemies of the people, but the rehabilitation through work. And that is precisely what the new ministerial order is creating, work camps." So, yeah, what do we see here? They're talking about tearing out the evil roots of society, getting rid of the enemies of the people, creating work camps. Was that Stalin? Was that Mao, Pol Pot? Well, actually, it was Juan Garcia Oliver, who, let's see, he was the Minister of Justice of the Second Spanish Republic, so the CNTFIA. And yeah, obviously they had work camps. I've always wondered what the anarchist rebuttal was to this. And so I went on Reddit, and it was funny because they were saying, like, well, it was mostly fascists that they put in the work camps anyway. Well, the people in the work camps got paid, so it's better that way, and it was rehabilitation. But isn't that what we generally say about the gulags? I mean, I would say gulags are historically dated, but I mean, generally when you see people defending the gulags for that time, it'll be like, well, I mean, the people were paid. They had actually their own prisoner magazines or newspapers that they could release and all this stuff. But it's just funny. It was funny to me to see the anarchists kind of go back to that argument that they condemn us for all the time. But
I mean, I really think all that comes down to is when you're actually trying to build socialism, there are methods and organizational tactics that you use that are pretty much universal whenever you see like a successful revolution or a successful attempt to build socialism. And they have to resort, these libertarian anarchists, they have to resort to using very authoritarian means. I mean, we talked a little bit about this before stream, but violence, the use of force, is authoritarian. You can call that authoritarian from a moralistic sort of point of view, if you want to make that argument. And so if we follow that logic of condemning authoritarian tactics, condemning authoritarianism to achieve socialism, then you're asking for a non-violent, peaceful revolution, which I just don't think is going to happen.
right, yeah, basically. And I just want to read one more quote here briefly. This is actually from, I'm not familiar with this person, but based on what I saw, this is an anarchist. Their name is George Woodcock. But he says, quote, he's talking about Makhno here. He says, theoretically, the army was under the control of the Congress of peasants, workers, and insurgents. But in practice, it was ruled by Makhno and his commanders, and like all armies, was libertarian only in name. So yeah, it's kind of funny to see somewhat of a principled anarchist. He's even like, well, I mean, yeah, we can't really say it's a totally voluntary army. So I thought that was funny to see.
Yeah, and to me, it's also pretty funny because it's like, if Breadtubers found that out, would they start denouncing Makhno? Would they start denouncing the CNT-FE? Like, what form of workers' organization is acceptable to these people? As we'll see in later on in the video, they seem to, at least this person seems to think reformism is the way to go. But yeah, let's just move right on, because we got quite a bit to still go through.
Definitely.
Clarifying my own position, well, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. I advocate for state socialism. In order to achieve said socialism, I understand and advocate for the necessity of revolution. Reformism has failed over and over, and Luxembourg has...
Hey, Comrade Dankey.
Yeah, what's up?
Hey, you're echoing a little bit there. I think you might need to turn the video up a little bit too.
Ah, gotcha. Thanks, comrade.
Oh, no problem.
Reform or revolution. Regardless, as I advocate for a revolution, I also understand that this revolution won't manifest from thin air. I understand that it will logically entail a party constituted from the working class with sufficient political will and the support of the people. The work of said party may, we hope, culminate in revolution and the seizure of state power. Not only this, but I also understand that once state power is seized, we will require all sorts of new organizations to protect the new gains of the working class. An internal security apparatus, a military of some size, or nuclear weapons, certain levels of repression against reactionary sections of the population, landowners, former capitalists, fascists, etc. This will take the form of re-education or more severe measures if necessary.
So first off, I love that a Marxist-Leninist is using theory laid out by Luxembourg, a frequent and often very harsh critic of Lenin and the October Revolution.
Oh, was that just me or did the audio cut out?
I'm muted. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So yeah, before we move on to that and address that little comment, let's talk about this. This is from Funny Videos, and they say, how about rejecting the term authoritarianism just for the optics? And I mean, I think a lot of anarchists are confused. The only one who calls us authoritarians are anarchists and right wingers too. So nice to know they're on the same side, but not always. But it's not a label that we accept. We don't accept the moniker of being authoritarian. We don't go around and say, "Aha, I'm so authoritarian. I just love being authoritarian." That is a negative label, a moralistic label that's been assigned to Marxism-Leninism as an ideology. And as we previously discussed, it's a label that's entirely unbounded from material reality, and it doesn't have a definite cutoff point. There's no point where you can say, okay, you've crossed the line, now you're authoritarian. Unless, you say that line is violence, in which case, as we previously laid out, the CNT-FE and Macno, they were both just as authoritarian as you claim Marxist-Leninists are.
Yeah, and I know this is something he kind of hints towards later, but he was saying, social democrats, we kind of have a big debate about how we should deal with, the problems of like reactionary workers after the revolution and such. He doesn't really address what their conclusions are, but the way I kind of view this is, okay, so authoritarian and libertarian. Let's say, like, I guess by libertarian we can mean just even spreading like democracy, just having more democratic rights in your socialist state. That's going to obviously depend on your material conditions. So like, there's always going to be a fine balance between how, how much force you need over a certain section of the population. But I mean, isn't the dream like in a more highly developed socialist society, we can kind of get rid of those things? So, I mean, I'm sure if we took over power one day and reactionary workers sided with us, like, why would we need authoritarian means? You know what I mean? So it's responding to an issue, and that's why anarchists find themselves in the same position when they have a revolution. So if you just look at a place and say, oh well, their ideology is super authoritarian, it's like, I mean, North Korea is a perfect example. It's like, well, I mean, could you imagine being in that position? Like, would you want your revolution to survive, or would you not? So it's a life and death situation.
Exactly. It's like we're not talking about countries who are under ideal circumstances where everything's hunky-dory and they can build socialism freely and unimpeded. We're talking about countries that are under siege. They are under economic siege. They are constantly facing U.S. sanctions, assassination attempts, coups, contras, color revolutions, all of these other shady methods that the CIA uses to destabilize countries all around the world. And it's just funny,
right? Sorry, go on there, comrade.
And then this commenter Macbeth's Head points out, a social democrat defending Rosa Luxemburg is, it's pretty funny. It's, it's ironic.
Right. And I see where Base Jedi got back in the chat here. Yeah, sorry about that, comrade. I see where you said that your name is ironic. I would not have guessed that, but I see where you say you admit it's bad optics. It's not good optics. So yeah. That was my opinion, but yeah, I had no idea, but glad you made it back.
Welcome back, comrade. So, he says it's ironic that Hakeem is citing Rosa Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution, considering how much she criticized Lenin. But, unlike most of Breadtube, Luxemburg had a critical support for the USSR. And it turns out that various communists have disagreements about how exactly to build a socialist state, but they can also support efforts to build such a state despite their critiques. This sort of wholesale denunciation of actually existing socialism and all previous socialist governments leads to the widespread disregard of socialist theory and history, and it leads to an isolated echo chamber of Western leftists with Western ideas who constantly shit all over communism. They repeat anti-communist lies and Western capitalist propaganda, and they support reactionaries like Joe Biden.
Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, where's your authoritarian divide there? I mean, what's happening when these people are like supporting regime change? I mean, I feel like you would at least be a little more principled if you're like, well, Biden is a harm reduction vote, I believe, but I'm admitting that he's at least authoritarian because he's like imprisoned black people and contributed to mass incarceration, and he wants regime change and such. But they can't even do that. They'll call us authoritarian, but they can't. Even when they try and strategically vote, of course they aren't going to look in it themselves. But I guess I'm giving them too much credit.
Right. And then there's this notion that, because I think Vosh and his crew, they don't necessarily like Joe Biden, but they say that he can be pushed left. And I would resist that. I disagree. I think that Biden's entire political career shows that he is firmly in the pocket of the bourgeois, and he doesn't give a flying shit about the working class in the United States. You want to talk about pushing Biden to the left? We can't even push Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to the left, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, right now, she is resisting, standing up for Medicare for all and trying to get Medicare for all passed, or at least have it come to a vote. And it's the same radical liberals that said, let's vote in AOC, and then they will push the Democratic Party leftward from the inside. Those are the same people now that are shaming Jimmy Dore for trying to hold AOC's feet to the fire. And I mean, on this channel, I've criticized Jimmy Dore in the past for his conspiratorial nature, but I gotta give him credit. He's standing up for the right cause now. He's standing up for Medicare for all. When over 300,000 Americans have died from this, and Jimmy Dore, from what I understand, he's a stand-up comedian. He's fighting harder for Medicare for all than AOC is.
Yeah, it's amazing to see. I mean, I'm going to butcher it, but what is it? If you try and join the system, you're going to become a part of it. It's so true. It's been known for like 100 or so years. I mean, but of course, these people don't ever learn.
Right. And then this commenter, Papi Chulo, also points out that Biden talked about arresting anarchists. So it's funny, all these, libertarian socialists who are voting for Biden, these anarcho-Bidenists, how are you going to feel once, the police state cracks down on you?
Yeah, it'll be an interesting moment. Do you want to continue with the video here?
Oh, yeah. We got quite a bit more to go through.
Right.
As well as advocating for a party with sufficient support of
see
the
it.
people, despite the fact that the Bolsheviks lost the Democratic Constitutional Assembly election and then promptly got rid of the institution. Also, his statement about state socialism further underlines the divide between libertarian and authoritarian socialists, because most anarchists, left communists, democratic socialists, and myself would argue that the state socialism he's arguing for is not actually socialism. But more on that later. Moreover, this part of the video illustrates a problem I have with Hakeem. Very often he'll engage in very innocuous rhetoric for actions that, if the history of 20th century state capitalism have any indication, lead to very serious and often deadly consequences. Take, for example, the claim for the need for an internal security apparatus, for example. Is that like when the East German Stasi literally established a spy in every single apartment tenant and engaged in psychological warfare of perceived enemies of the state?
Wikipedia. Oh, you're muted there, comrade.
Thank you. And so let's think about this objectively just for a second. Let's say you're part of a socialist government and your country is constantly being targeted by capitalist countries with sanctions, assassination attempts, espionage, sabotage, embargoes, coup attempts, color revolutions, military juntas, Contras, and other death squads, etc. Now, all of these operations are conducted by U.S. intelligence, namely the CIA. Now, if a country is being attacked in such a way, the only method of retaliation would be to form your own intelligence services to counter the CIA. So, I mean, let me ask you, what's the alternative? If a secret police force to combat counter-revolution is bad, then how do you prevent the CIA from running amok in your country? What's the non-authoritarian way to combat the CIA? This is the question that we'll be asking throughout the rest of this video.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, if the Western imperialists have it, to a certain degree, you either need it or you need to understand it. And that's the only way. I mean, yeah, you're going to end up with things that I wish humanity could do without, like secret police, nuclear bombs, and such like that. They aren't pretty, but yeah, I mean, I guess it's just very simple to say, but I mean, that's just real life. I mean, it's almost like a war type situation. I mean, that's why we call it the Cold War or whatever. I mean, it was that tense. So if you're trying to come out the victor, because you're going to come out one or the other. You're going to be the victor, or you're going to be the loser. So if you're going to win, I mean, unfortunately, you're going to have to match the enemy's tactics to a certain degree, but that doesn't give you just a blanket defense to just like commit genocide like the Western imperialists. But fortunately, we can say that the socialist countries of the last century didn't do anything on that scale, unless you believe like you said, the CIA media or something like that. But yeah.
A funny thing I like to do is compare the situation of socialist countries to a scene in The Karate Kid when Daniel-san was getting his ass kicked by the Cobra Kai. If Daniel hadn't have adopted authoritarian tactics and he tried to like make friends with the Cobra Kai, maybe they wouldn't have beat the shit out of him. But you know who came and saved Daniel? It was Mr. Miyagi, and he kicked their ass with karate. And so it's like that's what the communist countries have to do. They have to arm themselves. They have to militarize. They have to get a security special, secret intelligence service set up. These things are unfortunate, but it's because all of these countries are under siege. And once you consider the fact that Venezuela is under siege, Cuba is under siege, the DPRK, China, Vietnam, Laos, they're all under siege by Western imperialism, by the IMF, by the World Bank. They're being encircled. And so the only viable strategies to adopt are ones that would be condemned as authoritarian by anarchists, but would be deemed necessary and pragmatic by Marxist-Leninists.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure like Daniel from Karate Kid, he would have rather just been chilling than like catching flies with chopsticks and stuff like that. But when there's a threat, you got to prepare and sacrifice, some of your own time or whatever, and yeah, learn how to fight back or whatever. But yeah, hey, I gotta go to the restroom real quick, but I'll be back in a bit.
Okay, sure.
Right.
So we will just read a few of the comments here. So Cosmic Bread is asking, what's his channel name? Now, his name is Man in the Wall. And I mean, I'll be honest. I'll try to be nice. I don't think that Man in the Wall is necessarily a dumb individual. I wouldn't go so far as to say he's an idiot or he's a reactionary. I wouldn't even dare compare him to somebody like Steven Crowder because I know how much of a piece of shit he is. I would just say that Man in the Wall is exactly what I expected from a Vosh fan. Exactly what I expected. I mean, if I had made a caricature of a Vosh fan and had him, make a video like this, he would be saying the exact same things that Man in the Wall say. I mean, and we're just scratching the surface here, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get, into it once FVK comes back, and we're going to see just how far down the rad lib rabbit hole we go. But someone pointed out he's wearing an anti-communist shirt. And yes, that's true. You look at his avatar, and his character has the communist, the hammer and sickle crossed out. And so, I mean, that to me tells me that he cares more about being anti-communist, anti-tanky than he cares about being anti-fascist or anti-capitalist or anti-imperialist. In terms of his priorities, he's really got to get them straight, because I mean, there's a difference between constructive criticism or just having like criticisms and then just actively endorsing US imperialism and actively siding with US imperialism. There's a difference between saying, yeah, I don't agree with everything that China's doing, but I'm not going to support the Hong Kong protest. I'm not going to believe whatever Adrian Zenz puts out on social media or in the New York Times. I'm not going to believe the bourgeois media. And there are others like Man in the Wall who say, oh, I have disagreements with X country, therefore I'm canceling it. It's gone, it's evil, it's bad, it's horrible, and I'm not going to support them anymore, even if they're fighting against US imperialism.
Hey, I just came back. But yeah, like you said, I mean, imagine, like, talk about priorities in the wrong place. Like, that's your main enemy. Like, come on.
Oh man. So yeah, you go to Man in the Wall's channel, and he, in his recommended channels page, he links Vosh, but he also links Destiny, and he links David Pakman as well. So I mean, it really is like he's running the Radlib gambit here. Man in the Wall says, I've actively criticized U.S. policy multiple times. I mean, I'm sure you have. We all do. The point is that when the United States, when the National Endowment of Democracy, which is a CIA, cover organization, when the National Endowment of Democracy sponsors these Hong Kong protests, and the Western media says these Hong Kong protesters are standing up for democracy, and we say, actually, they're standing up for imperialism, they're standing up for colonialism, they're waving the British colonial flag, and they're telling Donald Trump, please come liberate us. It feeds into the goals, and it aligns with the goals of the CIA, of the anti-capitalist US government, of imperialism in general, for you to support this color revolution in Hong Kong. And it's not just Hong Kong. That's just one example out of many. You see it with Tibet. You see it with Xinjiang and the Uyghur situation. You see it with Belarus. You see it all throughout Latin America, Bolivia, Venezuela, Cuba. They're constantly trying to cancel those countries.
Yeah, I mean, and the biggest thing is, like, let's just take one example. I'll talk about it because I'm sure, but the Uyghur thing. I mean, okay, so you're concerned with Muslims being mistreated, them being, like, targeted because of their religion and such. I mean, okay, so we have that issue in China. Let's leave that aside. Can we not agree that, like, there is other issues that Muslims are facing in other countries that are more dire? I mean, I don't want to do like a victim hierarchy kind of thing here, but, like, can you not at least see that, like, there has to be a reason why the U.S. media is picking out Xinjiang over Palestine, over Yemen, also like countries in Africa that are getting bombed by like AFRICOM and such like that. I mean, look, so it is just funny. It would be one thing if these people are like, okay, I don't like the Uyghur thing, but let me talk about all these other things too, because they might bring that up at other times. But, like, it's just so funny that that's like the main thing they bring up. It's never like let's have an in-depth discussion about Yemen and how, like, the U.S. is like supporting that war. It's always just like, oh well, the U.S.'s enemies, if they do something, then I can talk bad about them, and I probably won't get a lot of flack for it online because everybody hates China. So it's very safe, it's very watered down, and being consistent.
I mean, I definitely don't want to misquote Man in the Wall. I don't want to mislabel him. I don't want to misattribute any political beliefs to him. Um, my criticisms, I don't really know that much about him, to be honest. All that I know is that on Twitter, he identifies as a social democrat, and in this video, he seems to identify as an anarchist. But that could have changed. People change their political views a lot of the times. But anyway, we can move on a little bit. We've still got quite a bit.
What about the necessity for a certain level of repression against reactionary sectors of the population? Would that be like when Stalin liquefied the kulaks, leading to the deaths of more than 500,000 people over the course of just a few years? The requirement for re-education?
Pause real
Would that
quick.
take the form of the Viet?
I don't want to hold it up, but I always am just interested, and I noticed that may have been one of the most lowest numbers I've heard from a anti-communist. Yeah, I see where he said he condemns Yemen. I'm sure a lot of like these folks do, but like I don't know, it just seems so inconsistent to just harp on one thing and then not like be like, okay, the U.S. media it is overhyped, or it is like trying to contribute to regime change in China, but I still support the Uyghurs. Why couldn't it be like that? It's always just like, oh, we're just going to totally just soak in all this, CIA propaganda and uncritically think about it. That's what I'm saying. So I'm sure like folks, with your position, probably have a more other things in the world that you're concerned with, but it's just questionable when you only point out certain things. But yeah, I noticed he said like 500,000 deaths caused by Stalin's collectivization. That's probably the lowest number I've heard from an anti-communist. Normally it's like millions.
Right. And I just want to say that I'm sure that Man in the Wall and us agree on a lot of different things. I'm sure that we can agree that U.S. imperialism is bad. I'm sure that we can agree that Donald Trump and the alt-right and fascism is bad. I'm sure that we can agree, at least to a certain extent, that capitalism is bad. I'm not really sure about that, but I also think somewhere along the way, you got lost listening to the CIA synthetic left narrative about all these countries. And it's a very easy thing to do. It's very easy to recognize that something's wrong with the system. Most people already understand this. They don't, it's kind of like a primitive class consciousness. They know that something's wrong. Even most conservatives out there know that something's wrong with the system, with the economy. Their anger is geared towards fellow working class people like immigrants and refugees instead of towards the bourgeois. But the point is that this primitive class consciousness can help you arrive to populist leftist opinions, like being against the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, being against drone strikes, being against Guantanamo Bay, being against the war on drugs. You have all of these common issues that Marxist-Leninists would be more than happy to stand alongside people like Bernie Sanders and fight for those issues, like fight for Medicare for all, for example. But I think it becomes very easy to recognize that there's a problem, but it becomes very hard to start deprogramming yourself from the capitalist propaganda that we've been inundated with ever since childhood. I don't know about you guys, but when I was in school, I had to sing or recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and they try to drill this nationalism into your head, and it takes a lot to deprogram yourself from this sort of American exceptionalist, pro-bourgeois Western democracy mindset. And there is this mentality that like Marxism-Leninism has been tried and it's failed and we should just move on. But for those of us who actually study Marxism-Leninism, we understand its practical applications, and we understand it's really the only foreseeable method to build socialism.
Yeah. Do you want to continue the video here?
Yeah, let's and I'll just be saying this, that I'm set to have a debate with Man on the Wall on Sunday, and I look forward to discussing more of these issues with him there. He says, I oppose regime change in Syria, so that's good. I don't like Assad. I mean, that's fine. You can have, that's actually hopeful. I'm glad to see that, because it's like you can disagree with a certain country's leader. You can disagree with a certain country's politics, but you can understand that they serve as a point of stability in an otherwise very unstable region. And if the United States is allowed to go into Syria and do whatever they want, a regime change and whatnot, the entire region is going to be much more chaotic than if we made sure that Assad stayed in power. But anyway, let's keep moving on.
Vietnamese re-education camps installed after the fall of Saigon, in which supporters of the former South Vietnamese government, many of whom were civilians, were subjected to the exact same kind of political detention the far-right Diem government inflicted on communist sympathizers in South Vietnam.
Okay, so, I mean, he's basically saying that the use of re-education camps is just as bad as, the Diem regime, that the U.S., the colonialist, imperialist U.S. puppet regime that hated its own people. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about that, FEK.
Well, I mean, we kind of talked about the work camp issue and such, and like I said, I mean, you can't just call out somebody else while you have like a thorn in your own eye, and it's to just say, I love the CNTFIA, I love Max's army, but I don't like Vietnam because they had camps, and so did the Soviet Union. That doesn't work. You got to at least deal with the reality. You got to at least be like, okay, I know that we had camps too, but here's the thing. Like, there's none of that. It's all just like expecting like we don't read or something.
Let's see. A commenter points out, has the PCUSA actually been going out there and doing stuff like bringing the goods and supporting the lower class? I don't know what they mean by bringing the goods. Like, I guess food drives and stuff like that. I mean, we have commissions for that kind of thing.
Yeah. As far as I would say, as far as like what PCOSA does, as far as working with the actual like proletariat and such, as far I know more about like here in the South. I know that in Alabama and Florida we have like a People's Coalition, or it's called a People's Council, and it's actually PCOSA and the PSL, and they do work like that, I believe. So I'm glad to see that some of our chapters, yeah, I believe they do work like that.
Oh man, is Fat Controller here in the chat? Where's he at? Come on out. Let's see. He says, I'm not saying that North Vietnam and South Vietnam are as bad. South Vietnam was worse, but in terms of their use of re-education camps, they're very similar.
I mean, honestly, like I'm not afraid to say that I haven't read super, like, I don't know, super in depth about like what Vietnam had specifically about re-education camps. I've read more about other countries, but I mean, look, yeah, I mean, we can say that up until the 50s, most Western developed countries had re-education camps of some sort. So, I mean, I don't find it that surprising that communist countries would have a similar thing. We don't have like a bunch of evidence of people just being like tortured. I mean, I know everybody's read the Gulag Archipelago or whatever, but like, I mean, a work camp is a work camp. But I mean, once again, I mean, at least in the gulags, it was like most of the people were actually just like petty criminals and such like that. But I mean, in the CNTFIA and such, it was mostly like fascists and people like that. So say what you will, but they were housing like common criminals too. So I don't know. Let's see. Also, the reason I can critically support Makhno and dislike Vietnam is because Makhno's Ukraine had a direct democracy, and Vietnam had a one-party state. Let me pull up a quote here real quick. Let me see if I have this like available. Okay, so this was at the time, I believe this is 1919. This is when Makhno's army actually grew to its like biggest stage. I can't remember. I think it was like 40,000 people or so were in the army. They had the free territory. Well, you know, they were doing pretty good. So they were like, how about we have a an election? You know, I mean, doesn't that seem reasonable? But here's what Michael Mallet, and he's actually a supporter of Makhno, but you know, sometimes historians have to be honest, even if they like a guy. So Michael Mallet admits, this is a quote from Marxist Left Review, and it's called Makhno, the Failure of Anarchism. It's an article. He says, he's a supporter of Makhno. He admits that the fourth Makhnovitz Soviet Congress, there was no electoral campaign for delegates. The Makhnovitz holding that this would open the way for political parties to make a mess of things and confuse the electorate. They're basically saying that political parties aren't a good idea at this time, and we can't really vote because the workers really don't know what they want. So we have to just kind of like decide things now, and we'll kind of maybe worry about democracy another day. Well, doesn't that sound like a vanguard party or something? I mean, that's kind of, once again, you're forced into those positions. And am I surprised that Makhno made that choice? Not really. You're taking over a territory. People don't know who the fuck you are. You're going to have to make some decisions if you're going to survive. So he had to give up some of his principles. I don't know. That's my overall like kind of thing there with Makhno, though, at least.
I mean, really, to me, what it seems like is that the fundamental disagreement is whether power should be centralized or whether it should be localized. And, you know, I think when you are dealing with countries that are under imperialist siege, the best strategy is to centralize your economic coordination. Having individual communes with a loose network of alliances without any sort of national assembly or national organ of workers' control, I don't see how that could lead towards anything other than the slow, you know, partition of these communes into rival factions that can be exploited by imperialism even further.
Yeah, I would urge comrades to read that article. I'll try and like link it in the chat after this, but okay. He's made videos criticizing the Vietnam War. Yeah, legit. But yeah, I urge comrades to read that article. There was a section there where they were talking about Makhno's free, I can't remember his wording, like free anarchist communes. But it basically attracted a lot of petty bourgeois elements. A lot of those elements weren't, you know, there was not a lot of clarity on what he was talking about. So there was people that supported Makhno who were thinking like they had a different vision. There was kind of miscommunication going on. Like that wasn't all of his supporters, but that was definitely a problem. Just to end the Makhno thing, I just want to read one last quote, and this is from none other than Trotsky. So, but you know, he was there during the time he was involved with that. So this is what Trotsky says. He says, "Hostility to the city nourished the movement of Makhno, who seized and looted trains marked for the factories, the plants, and the Red Army, tore up railroad tracks, shot communists. Of course, Makhno called this the anarchist struggle with the state. In reality, this was the struggle of the infuriated petty property owner against the proletarian dictatorship." So yeah, obviously I'm not a fan of Trotsky, so I know he's a liar, but I don't know if he's being totally honest. But I have seen that claim made before, and once again, yeah, there was petty bourgeois elements that were like, oh yeah, I'll have a free anarchist like little plot of land. That sounds awesome. You know, that's better than like a collective one. So yeah, you can imagine who got on Makhno's side after a while.
Right. And then we have this comment from Annex Hoffman that says, non-compete can have a bad take or two, but I would still have a beer with him. He's non-sectarian. And I think that's an important point for us to bring up is anti-sectarianism. Me and FEK, we're Marxist Leninists, but we don't have a problem pragmatically forming alliances or popular fronts to fight against a common cause, a common enemy like capitalism. We could work with anarchists. We could work with even social democrats to a certain extent. Like I said in my video with critical support for Bernie Sanders, there are certain alliances, pragmatic alliances that you can make as a Marxist-Leninist or as any leftist to fight against capitalism, to fight against imperialism, to fight against colonialism. And the key to doing that, the key to organizing, is to not be sectarian, to not cloister yourself off in this ideologically pure echo chamber where you aren't you're not actually taking any action. You're not actually helping the working class. You're just sitting around on your armchairs jerking yourself off about how woke you are, instead of actually going out there and organizing.
Yeah.
And so, all that being said, my interactions with non-compete have been nothing but cordial. I'm sure that we disagree. I'm sure we disagree about anarchism, but at least he's not calling me a fascist. And
Yeah, not even to mention that his I don't know if they're married or if that's his girlfriend. I don't want to get it wrong, but his partner is like an ML and he's an anarchist. So that's some solidarity right there.
Right. We need Luna Oi here on the stream to clear up all this misconceptions about North Vietnam,
which entailed hard and often dangerous labor, torture, disease, and starvation? Or is it like what China is doing to the Uyghur Muslims in their re-education camps as we speak? I mean, as long as...
All right. I mean, we've already very briefly hinted or talked about the Uyghur situation in Xinjiang. And unfortunately, this is an argument that we keep seeing coming up. And I know for a fact that I'll be doing a future video on Xinjiang, breaking down what is going on there and how the Western media is completely lying and fabricating this, quote unquote genocide that's happening. But maybe FVK could just very briefly explain what is actually going on in Xinjiang and where these rumors are coming from.
Well, I would say that I'm not afraid to criticize China on various subjects, but I wish that I could accurately criticize them when these questions come up. Because, when you're, all right, take the situation that they're dealing with in that part of their country. Yeah, nobody's perfect. I'm sure there's probably things that were done wrong, but it's hard to critique them when somebody's saying totally false things. If you're just giving information that's variably wrong, you can't be surprised that people are like, oh, I'm skeptical about this situation. I'm not going to say there's any there's not no mistreatment of Uyghurs at all. But I mean, my goodness, like I said, I want to be able to give a real critique, but unfortunately, all the information we have is so tainted that we can't even give that. So it's hard to even criticize it from that point. Does that make sense? You see what I'm saying there, Dankey?
Right. It makes a lot of sense. And here's the deal. Okay. The capitalist media lies about socialist countries. That much should be obvious. That should be obvious whether you're a Marxist-Leninist or an anarchist or a social democrat. It's obvious. The capitalist media hates communism. They hate communist countries. They want the world to think that these countries are horrible places that no one should ever live. They're authoritarian hellholes. And so, of course, they will manufacture this lie about a genocide that's going on in Xinjiang. And let me ask you, why does the U.S. government care so much about the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang while we proceed to bomb other Muslim countries to oblivion, like Iraq, Hakim's country?
Yeah.
It's almost like our propaganda, our capitalist media is manufacturing consent against for action against China, and doesn't really care about the well-being of Muslims. And in fact, when you read what the Muslim world has to say about what China is doing and how China is handling their Uyghur population, you'll see that they overwhelmingly praise China's efforts in Xinjiang.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned like Adrian Zenz earlier. I'm sure a lot of people here in the chat have heard of Adrian Zenz, but just for anybody who hasn't, I mean, this is a dude who has written books about how, what is it called? All Christians won't be brought into like the afterlife. And he basically argues that you have to be like this super strict Christian if you're going to ever go to heaven. And most of them aren't real Christians anyway. So he's this weird sectarian kind of Christian. And he has said that it is his mission from God to save, the Uyghurs from China. So, I mean, like when we have these kind of figures who are like the leading experts, like you can't get a better expert. And why is it always just like Radio Free Asia who is like conducting, like they did an interview and they said, you can read their articles. They say their methodology and they say, we interviewed 4 people in different parts of Xinjiang who are like whistleblowers who work with the police. And these 4 people said that, a certain amount of Uyghurs in their area have been detained. So Adrian Zenz looks at this information and says, okay, I have these 4 people giving me these numbers. I'm going to expand that, and I'm going to expand it to the whole area of Xinjiang and assume that this is going on in the whole country, every inch of it. And that's how he gets his famous million number. So, I mean, like I said, I would love to know how many are actually in there. But because we're relying on people like Adrian Zenz, we don't really get quality information. So there you go.
Right. It's like, we're going to move on from this because if we get bogged down discussing these historical events, you bring up like 5 or 6 at a time and we have to, break it all down.
Yeah.
And I think stuff like this is just better served for a future video, discussions like this.
Right. I think we can maybe like let it play for like maybe like a minute or 2 here and then just kind of see like what's in it.
Right.
Daddy Vanguard Party deems any specific group they don't like to be reactionary, you could pretty much justify putting anything under that umbrella. And given the fact that Hakeem has gone on the record and defended all these states I mentioned above and many more, I frankly wouldn't be surprised if those types of actions are what he would favor in his ideal revolution.
By virtue of my advocating of what I mentioned above, I would probably be labeled as an authoritarian. I, of course, reject this label as it's meaningless. Nothing worth doing doesn't require at least some level of authority.
So, a few things. 1, the definition of authoritarianism isn't meaningless. Merriam-Webster defines authoritarianism as, quote-unquote, of relating to or favoring a concentration of power in a leader or an elite not constitutionally responsible to the people.
Okay, I mean, again, Hakeem isn't saying that the word authoritarianism is meaningless. He's not saying that this word like doesn't have a definition. He's saying that it has no material basis. Just like I explained earlier, the words authoritarian and libertarian have no material basis and are simply moralistic buzzwords. I could just as easily call Man in the Wall an authoritarian, considering he embraces social democracy. I mean, it really is just a political buzzword that you assign to your opponents. Daniel G is asking me to check my Discord. I can't do that right now, comrade, because when I'm streaming, it won't let me show Discord when screen share's up. So I'll have to check it as soon as the stream's over. But yeah, unless there's something you want to say, FVK, I recommend we just move on.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the authoritarian libertarian divide, I mean, I think the words, I get what you were meaning though, but I think they are useful to define certain, certain ideologies. I don't know. Well, libertarian, like more with an ideology, authoritarian more with like the way a state like carries out, repression and such. So they're kind of different in that way. I don't really see authoritarianism as an ideology. So I think they're useful terms. They just aren't like total opposites, like he's trying to say. Like they aren't like these two diametrically opposed things. Like one is an ideology, the other is like, the repressive force of a state. But that's all.
It's like this commenter pointed out, authoritarianism is subjective. Saying that something's authoritarian or libertarian is a subjective opinion. It's not an objective fact.
Like, I know libertarian is broad, but say like, if you want to say libertarian is in the sense of like, I don't know, achieving something for the proletariat. Well, sometimes you need to use authoritarian means to achieve democracy and like for the proletariat and such. I know that can like, I know people like Radlibs will probably scream at that, but I mean, that's how a state functions. I mean, there's a certain section of society that's like exploiting people. And unfortunately, you want to give them a chance or whatever, but most of them are going to fight against you or whatever. So, I mean, you're going to have to use forceful means at times, but we can keep rolling here.
So yeah, it is literally by definition not meaningless. But that doesn't really matter, since I don't think Hakim actually believes this logic, as Biden accusations of authoritarianism against fascist regimes would also be meaningless. What he's doing is trying to dismiss the validity of a concept as a means of excusing his own bad ideas. It's just like when racist alt-righters deflect allegations of racism by saying that racism isn't real, or anti-racism just means anti-white.
All right. So, let's get this clear. Man in the Wall, a Western leftist, is comparing Hakim, an Iraqi leftist. He's comparing his supposed denial of authoritarianism to an alt-righter saying that racism isn't real. And now I've spoken extensively about how these breadtubers compare us to Nazis and the alt-right and how intellectually dishonest it is to do so. The same radlibs that call for left unity one day spend the next day shitting all over tankies. I can only wish that they had the same gusto for going after fascists. But, we see whose symbol is crossed out on Man in the Wall shirt, and it's not a swastika. As much as I may disagree with anarchists, it would be extremely ignorant to refer to them as fascists. So, I just feel like that is a very poor comparison to make.
And it's effective in both cases, because now whenever anyone brings up allegations of racism or authoritarianism, the people who ascribe to those ideals can simply brush it off.
Let's flip over to our libertarian friends. With them, there's a little more diversity in views. I'm discussing only those that are Marxists in this case. I'm not interested in liberals who think voting for Biden or whatever is what should be done. That's the sort of brain rot that will require its own video. Or reading theory. Please, oh God, read some theory, please.
So first off, not everyone who is suggesting you should vote for Biden is a liberal. Socialist figures like Noam Chomsky, Vaush, and Xanderhall have all come out with pro-Biden positions. The reason for that isn't because we believe that he's going to bring on the workers' revolution, but because Biden, for all his many failings and faults as a politician and a person, is better on policy than Trump is.
Okay. So
I want to see where he finishes with that real quick, if you don't mind, because I think you might have a second more, but yeah.
At least for us Americans. Also, as far as the reading theory thing, that's a common point.
All right, we'll get into the reading theory thing later, but his comment about Joe Biden, I feel like, is worthy of addressment. So he says that Biden is better on policy than Trump. This means nothing. Biden can make all sorts of promises to pull at progressive heartstrings, but he won't follow through on them. And the notion that he'll be pushed further left by Breadtube of all things is very naive. Chomsky comes out and supports Joe Biden. Is it any surprise? Chomsky is a liberal, as Too Comfy points out. Xanderthal isn't even a socialist. He's a social democrat. And, for that matter, Vaush isn't a socialist either. He's some weird anarcho-Bidenist man-child.
Yeah, I mean, we've had this debate for months, but it isn't who has more good policies. I don't think that's the question. I think the question is whose quality of policies are the best. And I don't know, when you're talking about policy and stuff, that's just stuff that they put up for a vote and they were able to I don't know, support or not. But okay, you want to talk about policy. Yeah, Trump worse than Biden or whatever. But if you compare Biden to other Democrats, even like slightly progressive ones, wherever they may be. I mean, you can't say that this guy's like his strong point is his policy. Like, I feel like the last thing a Biden defender would do is bring up, well, he's got good policy. Like, that's, if anything, his weakest link. So I don't know. That doesn't really seem like a good argument there.
Right. And I mean, I know he specified he was talking about Biden's policy for Americans, but socialists, Marxist Leninists, we're internationalists. So, okay, so to his credit, this was before Xanderthal came out as a SOCDEM, but it really shouldn't be any surprise to anybody. But anyway,
yeah, I posted that meme of Uncle Rico from Napoleon Dynamite when Xanderthal posted that he was like a SOCDEM. I was like, well, I could have told you that.
Right. Let's see. I forgot where I was going with that, so let's just keep on going.
Amongst Marxist Leninists. So much so it's basically been turned into a meme. Hell,
you're echoing there.
And the main reason for that is because it's used as a substitute for any actual argument. Hakeem doesn't give any reason as to why you shouldn't vote Biden. He just gestures towards theory as a placeholder for any real points, which is funny because Marx, in his day and age, made the same kind of harm reductionist choices we leftists have to make in the 21st century.
All right, so State and Revolution, shout out to State and Revolution Chapter 1, where he talks about how liberals try to besmirch Marx and turn him into they try to cleanse him of his revolutionary nature. This is what we're talking about here. But before we get into that, he says that tankies use, read theory in lieu of arguments. Now, anybody who understands theory knows that it serves as a guide on how to understand the dynamics and tactics of revolution and of building socialism, while at the same time understanding capitalism as it evolves. All of this involves a great body of knowledge from lifetimes of experience organizing a socialist revolution or leading a socialist movement. Many of the arguments that occurred throughout history, such as arguments between anarchists and Marxists, already occurred and have been long addressed in Marxist-Leninist theory. It's a science, and it continues to evolve and improve over time, just like any other field of study. A self-described socialist being ignorant of theory would be akin to a doctor not knowing basic biology. And as we'll see later in the video, Man on the Wall's understanding of theory seems dubious at best. But I was also reminded of what I was going to say. Communists are internationalists, and it doesn't matter how many goodies Joe Biden can give the American working class when he's bombing the working class of the third world to smithereens. It doesn't matter. So forgive me, my primary concern isn't just American workers, it's the workers of the world.
Yeah, that's basically where it comes down to. But we can keep rolling, so hopefully we can finish this thing.
Okay.
During the Crimean War between imperial European powers, Marx sided with the British and the French over the Russian Empire, which he viewed as being deeply reactionary. So maybe, just maybe, Marxist-Leninists don't actually care about leftist theory at all. They just contort and cherry-pick whatever they like from the original socialist thinkers and writers in order to cobble together a defense of their dumb ideas.
So, I mean, let's talk about this. Marx was a harm reductionist. Marx supporting Western capitalist countries against a repressive Russian monarchy is consistent with his theories of historical materialism. Due to the nature of how a capitalist nation is more socially advanced than a monarchist one. But this certainly doesn't mean that he would support a guy like Joe Biden. And arguing about who Marx and Engels would or wouldn't support is meaningless. They existed within their own time and under the material circumstances of the society in which they lived. But historically, social democratic attempts to co-opt Marx have been used opportunistically to attempt to cleanse Marx of his revolutionary nature, such as the opportunism seen in the Second International. And he goes on to say that, Marxist-Leninists don't care about theory, and we just distort it for our own, quote-unquote dumb arguments. Dude, we literally wrote the theory. I mean, who do you think wrote Das Kapital? Who do you think wrote What Is to Be Done? Who do you think wrote On Contradiction? Who do you think wrote Left Communism and Infantile Disorder, Foundations of Leninism? All of these things were written by Marxist-Leninists. So, you know, this person seems to think that Marx and Engels, you know, would have supported a neoliberal like Joe Biden. By reading theory, we understand the experiences of past revolutions and we can learn from their mistakes. But for him to say, you know, that we just use theory and distort it for our own dumb arguments, I think shows, at least to me, that he doesn't really understand Marxist-Leninist theory.
Yeah, and the most, I mean, like, why has like Marxist-Leninist theory like kind of stood the test of time? I mean, the biggest answer to that is that these are people, the people who have developed these theories were ones who were engaged in praxis. They were engaged in on the ground work. And through putting their ideas into the real world, they were able to take notes and say, well, this doesn't work, this works, and maybe we should try this next time. And that's why theory is so important. It isn't just these guys just kind of thinking of things. Like, you know, even Mao and such, like these were all people who tried to do revolution. And luckily for us, you know, Marxist-Leninists, these people succeeded. And that's why their theory is like important and such. So it's not just, it's one of those things, if you're gonna like critique it, or if you're a leftist and you want to achieve socialism in some type of form, like, I feel like I would almost like respect the social democrat more if they were like, well, yeah, I feel like I learned some really good lessons while reading Marx and Lenin and such, but you know, I just you know, came to some different conclusions and this and that. But like instead, like somebody in the chat said earlier, like they just kind of quotes mine, and you know, it's just kind of like, oh well, you know, Marx would have voted for Biden because he you know, he said this or he said that, or because Lenin said that people should participate in like electoral politics. Well, gosh darn, that means he'd probably vote for Biden. Like, you know, that kind of stuff doesn't really work.
Right. And then so he points out Marx and Engels weren't Marxist-Leninists. Lenin literally wasn't alive. And I mean, you're right. Marxist-Leninists didn't exist in the time in which Marx and Engels lived. The concept of Leninism didn't exist. But Leninism is a natural expansion of it's building on the foundation that Marx and Engels set. It's a continuation of Marxism. It's a next step. It considers organizational tactics and specifically in response towards imperialism. And so when you talk about Marxism, it becomes Marxism-Leninism after Lenin further develops theory.
Yeah, like we say, Leninism is just simply Marxism, which is the, you know, applying dialectical materialism. It's applying dialectical materialism in the age of imperialism. So obviously we view it as an extension, like you said. I know there's probably debate there or whatever, but what was I going to say? I just totally blanked. You can continue though there.
Okay. And then, you know, I should also point out that Marx vehemently disagreed with anarchists, as did Engels. Engels wrote an entire book called On Authority. And I highly recommend Man in the Wall and other Breadtubers go give it a look. It's a Breadtube-sized book, ladies and gentlemen. It's only like a page long, so they should be able to handle that.
As for libertarian Marxists, logically they too want revolution, we hope. State or no state. They too think a coordinated effort of the working class with sufficient political will can result in the changes desired. Logically, they too also understand, to some level, that reactionary trends will exist after the revolution and will require some level of authority to be dealt with. This is the thing, though. Notice how there are no differences. Within quote-unquote libertarian socialists, if they understand the fact that there will definitely be reactionary trends and fascists to deal with, they would also definitely understand that this means prisons, this means violence, this means some sort of security apparatus to keep track of these people, and on and on. So why do they consider themselves libertarian? If the goals are the same and the methods required to achieve them are by their very nature authoritarian, why do they want to separate themselves, or more correctly, designate some other group as different? When we talk about capitalism, no logical person on the left discusses libertarian capitalism versus authoritarian capitalism. The difference is only in aesthetics. US or French capitalism isn't any more libertarian than Taiwanese or South Korean is authoritarian. Poverty is still violence, lack of healthcare, workers' rights, unemployment, etc., etc. These are all different avenues of the same authoritarian tendencies.
Again, I think the divide between authoritarian and libertarian socialism is much bigger than Hakeem claims it is. True, most libertarian leftists agree that some kind of state repression is necessary, but there's a vast disagreement as to the extent of it. Simply put, there's a...
All right. Yeah, let's just listen to a few more seconds.
pretty big difference from saying that
military borders or prisons might be necessary in the short
You're
term,
echoing.
and advocating for these re-education camps and barriers to freedom of movement. And ironically, I think the second half of the
Oh, I was echoing. Yeah, let me rewind it because this is an important point. I don't want people to miss this.
necessary, but there's a vast disagreement as to the extent of it. Simply put, there's a pretty big difference from saying than Hakeem claims it is. True, most libertarian leftists agree that some kind of state repression is necessary, but there's a vast disagreement as to the extent of it. Simply put, there's a pretty big difference from saying that a military or borders or prisons might be necessary in the short term and advocating for the use of secret police, re-education camps, and barriers to freedom of movement.
All right, so I mean, once again, you want to talk about the state, we're talking about the use of force, the use of violence. And if you believe that capitalism should be overthrown, the best way to do that is through revolution. The only real way to do it is through revolution, to a certain extent. And so, when we talk about, or when he talks about the, sort of authoritarian tactics that Marxist-Leninist states had to use, those were out of necessity, because it turns out when you try to overthrow capitalism, capitalists don't just readily stand down. You have to fight against them, and you have to fight against the remnants of capitalists in the country. You have to fight against the counter-revolutionaries. And so, it's funny because he admits what a lot of anarchists won't admit is that, yeah, they do need a state apparatus. They can say it's a limited one, but like I previously described, you might have a military, you might have prisons. That makes you a state by definition. Special bodies of armed men for the suppression of some class. That makes you a state. And so, it doesn't matter whether or not you call it an anarchist commune or a people's assembly. In function, you are functioning as a state. And as we've shown, the CNT-FE and the Black Army in Ukraine used methods of consolidating power that were just as authoritarian as the Bolsheviks. So, if Man in the Wall wants to be consistent, he would denounce not only all Marxist-Leninist revolutions, but all attempts to build anarchist revolutions as well. He would denounce the CNT-FE. He would denounce Rojava. He would denounce anyone who used violence, because violence is authoritarian.
Right. And he, I believe the wording he used was, he said that libertarian socialists kind of have a debate as far as to what the limit should be as far as state repression. I know, Comrade Dankey, I know you and Man in the Wall are going to have a debate. I kind of hope that that's something that gets brought up. What is the limit? Okay, you guys debate about what the limit is. Well, I'm sure that debate goes nowhere because, first of all, you're not in power. You can't actually find out what that limit is. So, once again, those things are going to be faced to you if you're successful, if you get that far. Talking about what is the limit of authoritarianism that we should use? I feel like we can't even really debate that. Once we come to a revolutionary moment, that question will be a lot more pressing. Like, I'm not saying let's not talk about it now because we want to, have somewhat of a plan. But still, it's your material conditions that are going to make you decide. Like he said, he didn't know the line. You debate about what the line is, where it should start and stop, but you're just not going to know.
Right. And like, I don't know, the weird thing that I see, again, I'll go back to my example about the CIA. It's like, what if your country is being infiltrated by the CIA and you don't have a secret intelligence service? You don't have a secret police. What are you going to do? Why is a military deemed necessary, but not a secret police or an intelligence service? Why are prisons deemed necessary, but not re-education camps? He makes these weird, distinctions where it's like, oh, prisons are acceptable, but re-education camps, no, dude, that's authoritarian. And that's all I think FVK and I are trying to point out in this stream, is that what one considers authoritarian and libertarian are entirely subjective.
Yeah, I would say they're relative. You know what I mean? It depends on which
Right.
side of it you're on. It's relative to who's benefiting, who's not. Is it for the ultimate good? That is a moral question, and that's something that I don't know, just a pure economic look won't tell you. So those debates can be had, but it's relative as far as, is a decision authoritarian or not. Is it more authoritarian to lock down the society and say, you guys can't go to movies because you're going to spread virus? Or is it authoritarian to say, oh, well, we don't really know, and we'll just kind of see if you guys die or not because we want you to keep working? Like, what's more, like, you can say that was less authoritarian, that the government didn't do anything, but it wasn't more moral just because there was a lack of authoritarianism.
Right.
And ironically, I think the second half of this clip serves to answer the question posed by the first half in regards to the difference between the authoritarian left and the libertarian left, and one that's pretty self-explanatory.
Which is that libertarian socialists care about democracy and authoritarian socialists don't.
So, I mean, I guess earlier before we were asking, what is his line? Where does he draw the line? Well, apparently it's at democracy. Apparently tankies just don't like democracy, folks. It's time to pack it all up.
It's no different than you're hearing like a conservative and they're like, they have like an anti-communist video and they're like, what's the dividing line between me and a communist? Well, I love freedom. I mean, it's the same kind of argument.
Communists just hate freedom. They hate freedom. They love authority. And that's that.
Libertarian socialists, whatever you want to say about them and their practice, believe in socialism as a means of further democratizing people's lives, of expanding the principles of enlightenment to further economic justice as well as social justice. Authoritarian socialists, like a team, don't care about that. I mean, why else would we call democracy quote-unquote aesthetic?
All right. So, I mean, obviously, when you look at Western bourgeois democracy, it is an aesthetic. True political power is kept in the hands of a few very wealthy capitalist elites that control our government, possibly the farthest thing from the interest of the people. Any notion that we in the United States live in a democracy is a moronic idea when one considers which class is in control.
Yeah, I'm not like totally sure what Hakeem actually intends when he says that it's for aesthetics and such. My understanding of that position though is, well, why would you say that people who are into social democracy and such, why are they just into it for aesthetics? Because that's something people say about us all the time. You're like, oh, you tankies, you just like dressing up in Soviet garb and such. But the reason why I would say they are focused on the aesthetic is because it doesn't seem like they win. Do they want to have a mass mobilization of workers to take political power? Or do they want to be like a fringe group who kind of just argues online and calls out each other? It just kind of seems like it stays there a lot of the time, but there's not a lot of discussion of how can we take physical power away from the state and put it in the working class hands. That's not as like, I don't know, high on their list as it should be. So it seems like it's a lifestyle. Like, I don't want to say all these people are bad intending. I think some of them might kind of fall into that group. But I think that the genuine ones who want to actually achieve something serious, even if they're not like an ML, they can at least like, you know, talk seriously about achieving workers' power and such. But
Right, I definitely agree.
Whatever you feel about liberal democracies like the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, etc., it's undeniable that they're closer to socialism than an authoritarian capitalist oligarchy like Cold War era South Korea, Taiwan, Chile, Portugal, Guatemala, etc. I mean,
Okay.
I'll say
Geez,
at least he called out Taiwan. I'll give him that. At least he said Taiwan, because that is true. A lot of people don't clump that in, but yeah, what's your response there, Dankey?
it's just it's funny because the U.S. government sponsored most of the regimes that he just named. Anybody who knows anything about geopolitics knows that America is the imperialist core of the world. The idea that we're somehow even remotely close to socialism is laughable. we sponsor revolutions to get rid of socialism in the third world. Why in the world will we let it take root in our own country? We wouldn't even allow Bernie Sanders, and he's a social democrat.
Yeah, I think I saw somebody saying there was an echo. They may not have heard it, but basically he was saying that he said, "Do you want to play?" Yeah, you just replay that little clip there because that was maybe one of the most striking parts of the whole thing.
Germany, static. Whatever you
Yes.
feel about liberal democracies like the United States, the UK, France, Germany, Japan, etc., it's undeniable that they're closer to socialism than an authoritarian capitalist oligarchy like Cold War era South Korea, Taiwan, Chile, Portugal, Guatemala, etc. I mean, by that logic.
So, I mean, that's what he said. He said that America was closer to socialism than these other extremely brutal, like far-right countries like Pinochet's Chile, you know, ignoring whose government helped Pinochet take power in the first place. It was America. So, you know, I don't know. It's very naive to think that America is even remotely close to socialism.
Yeah, so America's closer to socialism, but at the same time, it's spreading like fascist governments around the world. So it's like reproducing fascism, but it's closer to socialism. I mean, in a sense, America is closer to socialism in the sense that, like, as the means of production grow, the society, in a certain way, reflects socialism or is more apt. Like, we could, in a Western country, obviously, you have the means of production to hopefully, build a very, highly developed form of socialism. Not saying that the third world can't do it. I'm not saying that at all. But in that regard, I guess you can say we're closer, but that's just a weird way to phrase it, to say we're closer than them. Like, because anybody can do it. It depends how close you are to revolution. But
to me, that sounds almost like a Trotskyist argument. I don't know. Like, I get Trotsky vibes when I see arguments like America's closer to socialism than, say, like a third world country is.
Mm-hmm. I think it's kind of a vulgarization of what Marx meant. It's saying like, oh, well, it has to be this highly developed society that has socialism. In one sense, that's true. You need, like, if you want to have your socialism be the predominant mode of production, you have to have the highest technology, all of that stuff. But that doesn't mean that you can't like develop a form of socialism with what you have. You may not be like the most highly, you may not have the most high tech or whatever, but like if you're a third world country, you have a revolution, you're gonna eventually need that, obviously. But I mean, you can hold out. But I think he was kind of reading what Marx said, but just vulgarizing it and making it very like dogmatic, which like you said, is what Trotsky did in a way.
Right. And, we're going to try to wrap up the stream a little bit. We still have quite a bit of video to go through, but I noticed Ewoks Unhinged is also doing a live stream. I'll be sure to check that out later.
The difference between Nazi Germany and Social Democratic Sweden is meaningless because they're both capitalist. But I imagine Hakeem wouldn't say that now, would he?
Libertarian socialists understand this, and they surely aren't pacifists. Yet, to reject so-called authoritarianism, or to label others as authoritarian, despite the fact that both sides of this coin require the same methods, to reach their same desired goal simply makes them out to be just confused. That, or it's a certain measure of fear of the ruling classes labeling you as authoritarian, despite the fact that literal saints like Eliende and Sankara are demonized by them. Their words mean nothing.
This is a common notion I see amongst a lot of tankies, and even a fair share of populist-leaning leftists. It's true that the ruling class probably won't ever approve of socialism, no matter what form it takes. We saw that with Allende, which I'll talk about more next week. However, the solution isn't to simply shrug them off and accept the authoritarian label, it's to prove them wrong.
So before we talk about that, let's answer his comment. He said that America's closer to socialism domestically than Pinochet's Chile. I mean, that's true, but that's like saying that my turd is less stinky than my morbidly obese meth addict's cousin's turd. I mean, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. You're still rotting in a capitalist hellscape. Your average worker is still rotting in a capitalist hellscape. Just to me, that's like splitting hairs. That's like saying that Franco's Spain was closer to socialism than Hitler's Germany. I mean, I don't know. Does that? I don't know about you, FVK, but does that logic float?
Well, I think he's about to go into the Bernie thing here, so I think that may be a good. I don't know when you want to get out of here. I'm good for whenever. I'm off tonight, but I feel like the Bernie thing might tie into that well. So I'm curious what he says about that.
Oh yeah, I mean, so he says, basically we need to abandon authoritarianism, whatever that is, and embrace Bernie Sanders, and social democracy to bring about socialism. Now, I mean, apparently, Bernie Sanders has cured America of all anti-communist Red Scare hysteria. Oh, wait, the media fearmongers and lies constantly about communist governments. And it's almost like Bernie Sanders didn't popularize socialism. He just sort of parasitically attached himself to it to garner popular support. He proceeded to bend the knee and endorse Clinton in 2016 and Biden in 2020. How revolutionary.
Yeah, as far as the thing about us being closer to socialism, I remember what he's about to say here. I remember he says, well, Bernie has really popularized socialism and has gotten us it's gotten the subject in the mainstream. Now, like me personally, I'll defend Bernie. I voted for the guy. I agree with him on policy. I don't think he was going to bring a socialist revolution. Man in a wall probably didn't think that either. But even I know Comrade Dankey, in our party, the PCUSA, a lot of people, when we ask them, well, how do you get into socialism? A lot of people our age will say, well, I heard about it from Bernie and, kind of went from there. So yeah, I'll give credit where it's due. But yeah, so let's talk about that. Are we closer to developing socialism now than before? I pulled up this, it's a poll, it's from Gallup. Let's see what it's asking directly. It's saying 4 in 10 Americans embrace some form of socialism. So I feel like, polls, we don't really know how they are, but we can maybe get something from this. It says in 1942, Americans who thought that socialism was good was 25%. Those who thought it was bad was 40%. Those with no opinion was only 34%. Now, in 2019, Americans who think socialism is good is 43%. So that's up from 25% before. Americans who think socialism is bad is 51%, up from 40%. Now, Americans who have no opinion, it has gone down from 34% in 1942 to 6% in 2019. Now, that's good because we can see that people are having to kind of choose a side. You can't really sit on the fence forever. But you can see that, look at the amount of Americans in 1942 who are against socialism. That was 40%. Now we're here in, let's say in 2019, it was 51%. That was more workers were against socialism. So, I mean, yeah, Bernie Sanders popularized socialism for a lot of us. But, I mean, we can't just ignore that half of the country not only isn't favorable towards socialism, there's more people here that are actively opposed to socialism. So this causes, a different dynamic. Whereas before, there would have been more Americans in the middle who might be like, well, yeah, socialism ain't so bad. Now there's more Americans who are against it. So it's not as just kind of cut and dry. But like I said, I think that's a good thing in a way. We need a dividing line as far as, who's on which side. So I'm glad Bernie brought that about, but I don't think he's achieving as much as Man in the Wall likes to perceive.
Right. And, I'll go off more on Bernie Sanders in just a bit.
Look at what the Sanders campaign did in the United States, for example. In the course of just a few years, the entire discourse around socialism has shifted from a Cold War attitude to a new one in the era of late capitalism.
Hey, the Cold War's over, everybody. Somebody needs to tell China. Hey, the Cold War's over. And somebody also needs to tell Cuba and Venezuela.
Yeah, well, apparently somebody needs to tell Russia they're not the Soviet Union anymore so they can get out of the new Cold War, too.
It's, wow.
And he did it by reinventing the wheel and presenting a new kind of socialism to a new generation, not simply reheating the failed experiments of the past. Optics.
All right, so, the dissolution of the USSR was probably one of the most tragic events in modern history, and it was caused by treachery and opportunism and betrayal. Apparently, because of this, we need to disregard ML theory. How many socialist revolutions has the U.S. toppled over the years? Are their experiences and contributions to theory now null and void because they were crushed by capitalist brutality? To call the Soviet Union a failed experiment is misleading. The experiment was working. Socialism was working. Why? If it didn't work, if socialism could fall apart just based on its own internal faults, then America wouldn't have had to do anything during the Cold War. They could have just sat back and let the Soviet Union collapse under its own weight. But they didn't do that. The United States' entire geopolitical objective was to encircle the USSR, limit Soviet influence, and sanction and essentially blockade their country to hell.
Yeah. There's something I really want to respond to that, but I know he's probably about to mention like at any second here. I don't want to hold everybody too long. Like I said, I'm good as far as time, but yeah, do you want to maybe keep rolling it? Because I think he's about to say something here.
Oh, yeah.
Matter for leftists, and it's difficult for us to achieve a good standing optically when much of the media and the ruling class is against us. And it's difficult for us to achieve a good standing optically when much of the media and the ruling class is against us. But the solution isn't to shrug it off and continue apologizing for authoritarianism. It's to create something different that wins over hearts and minds.
All right, so let's talk about the hearts and minds that he is trying to get us to win over. He's literally talking about rehabilitating socialism to make it palpable for capitalists. Now, if you actually think that that could ever happen, you're extremely naive. Any notion that the American media or educational system or political system can be won over to socialism, it's extremely idealistic. The entire apparatus of bourgeois state power ensures that any effort made to popularize socialism in the United States is met with the full wrath of the bourgeois state. Look at what happened to Comrade Fred Hampton. The United States is the most anti-socialist country on earth. Again, we live in the imperial core, and social democrats like Bernie Sanders call themselves democratic socialists, but then urge their supporters to vote Biden or Clinton. They ultimately serve to uphold the same bourgeois and imperialist establishment that the neoliberal Democrats do. And so what Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Cortez and other democratic socialists in the U.S. represent is simply social democracy. It's not socialism. And it's not an end to capitalist exploitation or imperialism. And despite this, the right-wing media calls Sanders Bolshevik Bernie, and the liberal media calls him a radical lunatic. So ultimately, Despite these progressive efforts, socialism remains just as despised within the US mainstream media as before, and the tensions with the PRC continue to escalate. We're seeing a wave of anti-communist Red Scare hysteria slowly morphing into a new Cold War. And what Man in the Wall is suggesting is that we sever all historical and international ties to the wider socialist movement and support a theoretical and idealistic better way that hasn't been done before, which apparently entails voting for neoliberal bourgeois puppets, shitting all over socialists from countries attacked by U.S. imperialism, and defending a man-child like Vosh as a true leftist while calling Marxist-Leninists fascists. How truly revolutionary.
Yeah, I'm gonna hit the restroom one last time here, but you can keep rolling. I already saw this, so yeah, I'll come back in a sec.
Okie dokie.
All right.
This is nothing but a byproduct of over a century of rhetoric that has plunged deep the hatred of all honest and successful revolutionary trends for softer words and softer identification in order to possibly remind this social other, or perhaps themselves, that they aren't with those leftists, the ones that have successful revolutions, the ones that have lifted millions into literacy and a dignified existence, the ones that defeated the Nazis and invented space travel, the ones that supported countless revolutionary and national liberation struggles worldwide and whose absence is still sorely felt to this day.
This gets at another fundamental issue I have with tankies and disagreement authoritarian socialists and libertarian socialists have in common. Tankies and MLs will often make the actually existing socialism argument, attacking anarchists and left communists for their failed revolutions in contrast to ML's supposedly successful ones, which is funny given that two of the most successful anarchist revolutions failed largely because of Marxist-Leninists.
All right. So we've already talked a little bit about the Black Army in Ukraine. We've talked about the CNTFA. Let's ignore the fact that this narrative is completely false, and in fact, the reverse happened. Look up Casado's coup and the surrender of Madrid to Franco. We see how historically it was the anarchists who betrayed the communists during the Spanish Civil War, not the other way around. But I think it would be better if I talk more about this in a future video.
I'm back here.
But beyond that, this mindset highlights another major disagreement between MLs and left communists, which is that we don't view the 20th century so-called communist states as actually being socialist or communist, in large part because of authoritarianism. To understand this, we have to define socialism. Now, the definition of socialism, like the definition of capitalism or communism, is often muddled and blurred because different people have different perspectives on it. But in the broadest possible sense, we can agree that socialism is the worker seizing the means of production in the short term and the abolition of the commodity form in the long term. And in the Soviet Union, now it's China, North Korea, Vietnam, Cuba, etc., this did not happen. The workers did not seize the means of production. And this is in large part because of the way these states were implemented, namely through the Leninist concept of a vanguard party, namely where a small group of intellectuals create a state where they are the vanguard of the working class, originating in large part from the lack of education most peasants and working class people had in the Russian Empire at the time. And while, yes, that is a problem when it comes to revolution, the solution to it is education and organization, the kind the Black Army succeeded in doing during its short reign over the Free Territory.
All right, so, he's saying the Vanguard Party is made of these, armchair intellectuals who seek to become the new elite class in society. And this happened because most of the population in the Soviet Union and China were illiterate. And so by increasing education, like apparently the Black Army did, you can have people arrive to class consciousness without the need of a vanguard. Now, I mean, never mind who is doing the education, and never mind the fact that the Soviets didn't have a massive public education program and literacy program, which lifted millions out of illiteracy. The same with Cuba and China and Vietnam, the DPRK, etc. I mean, how out of touch can you possibly be? Communists have always been advocates for universal public education.
Yeah. I mean, basically, let's just think about what Makhno could have done, like in that 2 year. What was it, like a 2 to 3 year period, like at the most? I mean, you can't. I don't know. I would love to see what he means by spreading education. I'm not super knowledgeable about Makhno, but I know that he was recruiting people into his army. I mean, he might have been telling them I don't know, certain things of anarchist theory, but like beyond that, what was he doing different than like the Bolsheviks?
The problem with the Vanguardian solution is that it assumes that the Vanguard is incorruptible, that it can never act in its own interest outside the interest of the broader population.
All right, and so, you know, this is a different argument that apparently Marxist-Leninists assume that the Vanguard is uncorruptible. Hey guys, attention everybody. Turns out the mass line, the entire concept of the mass line and self-criticism doesn't exist. So, you know, let's just ignore the fact that the mass line and self-criticism are like central tenets to Marxist-Leninist theory. You know, for me, that just tells me again that Man in the Wall doesn't really understand anything about Marxist-Leninist theory, because he wouldn't say that if he understood the Marxist-Leninist, you know, idea of the mass line and of self-criticism.
Yeah, and why did he say that the USSR was not socialist? Did he make an economic argument? Did he say, oh, well, I don't know, like he didn't really go down that road. Instead, he just said, largely in part due to authoritarianism. So it's like, oh, okay, well, you said the famous buzzword, so yeah, that means it's not socialist. I mean, here's the thing, is like, could you have a socialism that was, I'm just going to think of something extreme, like a socialism that was homophobic? Unfortunately, that probably is possible. I hope that never exists. But like, it's an economic development of society. It's not like how moral is your society. It's not gauged on that ground. So yeah, I don't know. That's kind of what I'm seeing here.
Yeah, let's go ahead and move on.
But that is exactly what happened. In the Soviet Union, for example, without any real opposition allowed against the CPSU, the Vanguard moved further and further away from socialism, not towards it. Wage labor and commodity production continued to exist. Reactionary tendencies towards ethnic minorities.
So let's talk about this wage labor and commodity production still existing under socialism. Now, it's almost like Karl Marx had this to say in the Critique of the Gotha program. And this is Marx. He says, what we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it's developed on its own foundations, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect economically, morally, and intellectually still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. Accordingly, the individual producer receives back from society, after the deductions have been made, exactly what he gives to it. What he's given to it is his individual quantum of labor. For example, the social working day consists of the sum of the individual hours of work, the individual labor time of the individual producer. It is the part of the social working day contributed by him, his share in it. He receives a certificate from society that says he's furnished such and such an amount of labor after deducting his labor for the common funds. And with this certificate, he draws from the social stock a means of consumption as much as the same amount of labor cost. The same amount of labor which he's given to society in one form, he receives back in another. And so, you know, to explain this, what Marx is explaining here is that in a post-revolutionary society coming out of capitalism, the apparatus of workers' control are only just beginning to take hold, and it will take some time to consolidate control and to build the productive forces and form a state apparatus for the safeguarding of the revolution. Sure, you're still producing commodities and working for a wage. What did you think was going to happen? Did you think that the USSR just magically increases their productive capacity overnight and now everybody gets free stuff?
Yeah. You know, it's an interesting debate because, like, on one hand, I think you are right. There was commodity production to a certain extent. Like, I know even Stalin admits that in his, like, economic problems of the USSR. But what was abolished is, I don't know, it's kind of hard to, like, explain. And I probably need to, like, do some more reading on this. But so, like, when you read Marx's Capital, he refers to money as the universal commodity. And that's basically meaning that with money, you can like purchase anything. It represents value itself. So you can exchange other commodities for it. Um, so what was going on in the USSR? Did they have the universal commodity? Well, I mean, I would say they had money. I don't want to say they abolished money, but it wasn't a universal commodity. They couldn't buy means of production. They couldn't buy their houses. I mean, a lot of, like land, all these important things that you would need to develop as a capitalist, you couldn't buy with their ruble. So, in a sense, it was kind of like a labor note, if you want to use that kind of phrasing, but it wasn't like they were using money as we have like here in the United States because it was like restricted. So yeah, that whole commodity production thing is kind of, I don't know. I don't know if it's addressing the question the right way. I think the question should be, do they have the universal commodity as far as money? Can they buy anything? And the answer to that is no. Therefore, they can't be capitalists.
Right. And, again, we have to ask ourselves, how would this work in anarchist land? Like, would you not have labor vouchers in anarchist land? How would you divvy up the resources in society without the productive capacity necessary for communism? It just doesn't make any sense.
These became further cemented under Stalin, and acts of imperialism became more and more flagrant, culminating in 1979 when the Soviet Union launched a full-scale imperialist war of aggression and atrocity against the people of Afghanistan in support of a violent and unpopular regime.
All right, so we sort of missed the part where he talked about the Chechen and Ingush deportations, the forced deportations in 1943. So, I mean, let's talk very briefly about this because, once again, we're running, at over 2 hours now, and we just don't have the time to address every minute little historical argument that Man in the Wall is trying to make. So, I mean, let's talk very briefly about what was occurring in the Soviet Union during 1943. The Nazis had invaded and seized huge swaths of land, nearly making it to Moscow, and only being turned back after the fateful Battle of Stalingrad. At that time, the Nazis were making cliched promises to the people living under Nazi occupation for independence, including the Chechens and the Ingush. Edvard Radzinsky writes in his 1996 book Stalin that, quote, during their occupation of the Caucasus, the Germans had promised independence to the Chechens, the Ingush, the Balkars, and the Kalmyks. Members of these ethnic groups did sometimes collaborate with the Germans. The same was true of the Crimean Tartars, end quote. Now, this wasn't because the Germans actually cared about these religious and cultural ethnicities. Far from it. They were seeking to use Chechen separatists as puppets to secure the oil fields of Baku and Azerbaijan. Now, I'll be the first to say, under normal circumstances, such a massive relocation of minority ethnic groups represents a humanitarian problem. But once again, these were not in any way normal circumstances. The USSR was teetering on the brink of collapse, and the Germans were sowing the seeds of separatism throughout the occupied regions. If the Chechen nationalists, who were also Nazi sympathizers, succeeded in driving out the Red Army, it would be because they were assisted by the Nazis. The situation in the USSR at that time was so dire that the Soviet government wanted to do anything they could to prevent the Germans from securing more territory, especially the Baku oil fields. Now, is it really fair to judge the USSR for these mass relocations when we consider that they were in the midst of an existential war with Germany? What would have been the fate of the religious and cultural minorities in the Caucasus if the Nazis had won? They probably would have been holocausted. During any point in which Man in the Wall critiques the USSR, does he consider the historical and material conditions the country was under at the time? Apparently not, implying that such measures are par for the course for Marxism-Leninism. But there was nothing normal about World War II. All the decisions the Soviet government made during that time were under extreme conditions, and I shudder to think what our own government would do if we faced a war of total annihilation and we're losing huge swaths of our territory.
Yeah, yeah, for real. I saw somebody. I thought that was a really good. I haven't really read about like the deportations a whole lot, but that's an interesting like perspective to hear. I know he kind of goes on to something here. I saw somebody talking about this in the chat. They were talking about him talking about industrialization almost being natural in a certain way, and I think he's about to get to that like here in a second. So that'll
Oh
probably be
yeah.
like my last big rant when he gets to that part.
Yeah, he's about to get into that, but before we get into that, I want to talk about his comments about Afghanistan. So the People's Democratic Party in Afghanistan won power by assisting President Mohammed Daoud Khan to overthrow King Mohammed Zaire Shah, establishing the Republic of Afghanistan in 1973. And I'll speak more in a future video about the Soviet war in Afghanistan, but suffice to say, the forces that were fighting against the Soviet intervention were radical Mujahideen fighters who, because of their status as tribal rulers and landlords, were upset over the progressive policies that the PDP were implementing and were being supported by the CIA through Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. What the resistance to the PDP represented was nothing less than the forces of reaction, seeking to stop the democratization of Afghanistan and opportunistically sought to seize power at the expense of the people. And the funny thing is, for you movie buffs out there, you go and you watch Rambo 3, and apart from being a hilariously bad, over-the-top piece of American propaganda, it dedicates itself in the credits to, quote, the brave Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan. This is, of course, the same Mujahideen that would later form the nucleus of Al-Qaeda and launch the 9/11 terror attacks. And then we would spend the next 20 grueling years fighting an unwinnable imperialist war in Afghanistan. Had the Republic of Afghanistan remained intact, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda probably never would have come to power. Once again, we see Man on the Wall as siding with U.S. imperialisms. Oh yeah, and now we have to talk about imperialism, because that's what Man on the Wall claims the USSR was doing in Afghanistan. So, just to keep it short, what do we mean when we discuss imperialism? Lenin's book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, explains it like this. In order for capitalism to generate greater profits than the home market can yield, the merging of banks and industrial cartels produces finance capitalism, and the exportation and investment of capital to countries with undeveloped economies is required. Now, in turn, such financial behavior leads to the division of the world amongst monopolist business companies and the great powers. Moreover, in the course of colonizing underdeveloped countries, businesses and government eventually will engage in geopolitical conflict over the economic exploitations of large portions of the geographic world and its populace. Therefore, imperialism is the highest advanced stage of capitalism, requiring monopolies, both of labor and natural resource exploitation, and the exportation of finance capital rather than goods to sustain colonialism, which is an integral function of said economic model. Furthermore, in the capitalist homeland, the super profits yielded by the colonial exploitation of a people and their economy permit businessmen to bribe native politicians, labor leaders, and the labor aristocracy, the upper stratum of the working class, to politically thwart workers' revolts. This bribery, as described above, is exactly what U.S. intelligence services did to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. They were recruited to serve the United States geopolitical interests, which was the encirclement of the USSR, and they pitted the Mujahideen fighters, who, as I explained previously, represented tribal rulers and landlords, against the people of Afghanistan. The USSR's intervention in Afghanistan was to prevent CIA puppet radicals from taking over the country and destroying the progressive movement the PDP had built. And also keep in mind that the Republic of Afghanistan requested the USSR's help. So as much as Man on the Wall wants you to believe that this was an imperialist Soviet invasion, it was an anti-imperialist Soviet intervention.
Yeah, basically. You know, kind of just like leading off of what you just like finished with there. Uh, I read Max Blumenthal's book, Management of Savagery, and he talked about this section. There's a section in his book where he's talking about how I guess there was all these like banquets that they would have in Washington, like during the Soviet Afghanistan war, and it would be like all these think tank people, and they would have like rich donors, and basically what these rich donors would do is they would fund mujahideen fighters, and it was kind of like how you fund an orphan. You know, you like get a picture of them, and it's like, oh, here's the person in Africa that you're funding and such. Well, they basically let these like rich, wealthy people like sit next to their own personal mujahideen fighter that they sponsored, and they're just like sitting there with these guys who later became, you know, we were willing to admit they were terrorists when they fought us, and they're just like funding them like with the wealthy elite of America. So it's just like imperialism in a nutshell. But I thought that was amazing.
The vanguard, as opposed to being an alternative to the ruling class, became the new ruling class, governing with fundamentally different sociological class interests than the common worker.
All right, so I mean, just really quick, the Vanguard Party consists of the working class. And class, from a purely dialectical and historically materialist viewpoint, has its origin in relation to the means of production. What Man on the Wall fails to understand is that class interests of the Vanguard Party don't change from the class interest of the working class upon seizing state power, because the Vanguard consists of the working class and acts on their behalf. And before he says this Vanguard becomes the new bourgeois or a new class of intellectuals, perhaps he should familiarize himself with the central tenets of Marxist-Leninist theory, such as the mass line and self-criticism.
Yeah, and what does it mean to be like a new class? Like that's an economic definition. Like if you're going to make these arguments, like I just feel like there needs to be a little more meat on the bones. Like there needs to be some economic arguments, some statistics, but once again, it just kind of falls flat.
You know that phrase, absolute power corrupts absolutely? Well, it turns out that's pretty much true. Marx predicted that state capitalism will be a necessary transition between capitalism and socialism. But as it turns out, when you give a small group of supposedly Vanguardian rulers an enormous amount of power via the means of production through the state, with no real opposition or democratic process, they aren't going to give that power up. This is why we call it state capitalism, because a Vanguard Party controls the means of production, not the working class.
All right, so again, you know, this sort of misunderstands the structure and purpose of a Vanguard Party. Now, it's true that state capitalism is a temporary stage of development needed to build a socialist economy. The USSR had this period during the New Economic Policy from 1921 to 1928, and the PRC is in this stage now. Later, this stage was replaced by Stalin with mass industrialization and collectivization to bring about a truly socialist economy. It's important to note that while state capitalism was being utilized by the Vanguard Party in the USSR, capitalists were not allowed to have state power or military control or any other means to allow them to reestablish their power. The Communist Party was still in control, and so therefore the People's Revolution was secured, and the petty capitalists that were permitted to exist only did so to increase the productive forces and to provide a technical intelligentsia to assist in the industrialization and collectivization that would come later.
Yeah, that's basically it. You want to keep rolling here?
Oh, yeah.
And that's also why none of what Hakim argues for in favor of the 20th century state capitalist regimes have anything to do with them being socialist. I mean, space travel? The US landed on the moon. Does that make them socialist? Defeating the Nazis? Well, yeah, the Soviet Union did do that, although they were perfectly willing to openly collaborate with the Third Reich on the invasion of Poland and sat idly back for 2 years as the Nazis ravaged all mainland Europe. But that doesn't really have too much to do with socialism.
Right.
Okay, so
Yep.
yeah, I guess okay, I'll keep this short. You're a socialist country. You are underdeveloped, unfortunately, and here you are with a fascist threat right at your back door. Well, luckily for the USSR, they were already like mobilizing for 10 years and building arms to fight against the fascist threat. But still, in what was it, 1936, 1937, when they did that, when they supposedly let the Nazis invade Poland. Well, Poland's not their country. Poland is not the USSR. It is a separate country. So, like, look, okay, you're trying to build up a military to fight to defend your homeland. Are you really going to send your military out when it's not even ready? So you're going to go send your military out and just go like fighting people, even though you have more industrialization to go. It wouldn't have worked from a strategic standpoint. Honestly, if you're going to argue that they should have done that, they might have lost the war. So, I mean, fascism could have won in that situation. And like the U.S. would have probably, or yeah, the Western imperialist powers would probably said, oh, this is like Soviet imperialism. They shouldn't be, worried about Poland or whatever. You can't really win, but I think it was best for them to worry about their own situation at that time. I mean, I wish they could have saved Poland, but they didn't have the army for it yet.
Right. And of course, this is ignoring that Stalin had tried to convince Western Europe to form an anti-fascist alliance to stop Hitler, but he was refused. Neville Chamberlain, the conservative prime minister of the UK, signed an agreement with Hitler in Munich, recognizing Germany's claim to part of the Sudetenland. This Chamberlain-Hitler pact is seldom discussed in Western history or by bourgeois academia, but we often hear about how evil the Soviets were for signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler. There's a couple of things to keep in mind, apart from what Comrade FEK just said. After Munich, the USSR understood that Western Europe sought to appease Hitler and wouldn't help them fight the fascists. In the event of a German invasion, the USSR was being forced to fight them alone, or so they thought. And so Stalin made the only pragmatic move he could. By signing a non-aggression pact with Hitler and the partitioning of Poland, he secured the western border of the USSR. Were it not for this pact, the USSR may have been overwhelmed during Operation Barbarossa. So once again, I ask you, what's the alternative? And I'll also ask why Man in the Wall never seems to take the historical context into account. He wants you to believe that Nazis and communists worked together when in reality they were ideologically and politically completely polar opposites. The only reason why the non-aggression pact with Germany was signed was because the UK, France, and other Western countries refused to form an anti-fascist alliance.
America and the UK helped defeat the Nazis too. Does that make them socialist? As far as industrialization, this is a common talking point amongst MLs to defend two states in particular, the Soviet Union and China. In the case of the Soviet Union, industrialization, while impressive, although millions of people did die in the process, was something that seems like more of an inevitability than a specific product of socialism.
All right, so let's talk about this concept that industrialization is inevitable. And I know you have something to say about this, FVK, but I'll just say really quick that Marxists understand that industrialization is largely an inevitability, but in terms of the rate of social development, the USSR and China both industrialized extremely fast, going in a single generation from a semi-feudal pre-industrial backwater to an economic powerhouse within a generation or two. Imperialism would have undoubtedly made the rate and scale of industrialization go way down, as industrial production would favor comprador capitalists rather than the entire population. And the products of this industrial production, the wealth generated by the laborers, would go into the pockets of the capitalists who controlled society. So through this, we can see how the industrialization of the USSR and China weren't only unique because of its rapid development, but also because it industrialized society for the entire populace to benefit, not just these comprador capitalists. This allowed them to build roads, schools, hospitals, laboratories, dams, levees, dikes, bridges, tunnels, and all manner of things, which opened up the isolated regions of the country to the rest of the world, and massively improved the lives and opportunities of the people in those regions. Had Russia and China been colonized, the function of industry would be to generate profit for comprador capitalists and export those profits abroad. The workers who manufacture the commodities are prevented from purchasing them due to their low wages, dictated not by their own government, but by the International Monetary Fund or World Bank. So to think that capitalist industrialization is the same as communist industrialization is a very simplistic view of the world and of history in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to give a response to that as well. I think he's about to like say something. Just let it run for like maybe like 10, 20 seconds real quick.
Plenty of non-socialist countries that experienced an industrial boom before the Soviet Union. Plenty have experienced industrial booms afterwards.
Honestly, I think it's quite likely there would have been an industrial boom had Generals Kolchak, Denkin, and Korlanov defeated the Bolsheviks in the Russian Civil War. And as far as China, yeah, they have had a major industrial boom that's seen a huge period of economic growth and lifted many out of poverty, but that had in large part to do with the economic liberalization that took place under Deng Xiaoping. In fact, I've seen many libertarians and neoliberals use China's economic growth as an example of the success of capitalism and market forces. And again, this strikes me as more of an inevitability than anything else. I imagine we probably would have seen similar results had Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists successfully taken over the Chinese mainland. So yeah.
Okay. Okay.
They didn't shy away from.
Yeah. Pause it right here.
They're the only means of success.
So I've actually heard this argument too, also from libertarians. I remember, I believe it was the debate between Jason Unruh and Sargon, and Sargon was like, development would have happened anyway in the USSR, like without Stalin. Like his overall argument was, well, this whole, the whole 1900s, there was radical industrialization. So therefore, wouldn't like most countries develop? But my problem with that argument is, well, okay, let's think about that. So you're saying China would have just developed and it would have kind of just taken people out of poverty, no matter who came into power, if it was like the nationalists or not. So my question is, why hasn't that happened to Africa? Why hasn't that happened to Latin America? I mean, the answer to me is obvious. I mean, obviously imperialism is holding them down. But my rebuttal is, well, if imperialism was holding China down or like Russia down, would we not see a Russia that would almost kind of mirror Latin America a little more, or like a China that would mirror Latin America a little more, or Africa, or, just be kind of generally underdeveloped? Because we know that these capitalist countries that pop up in these different third world countries, they don't reach the kind of success that you're seeing with Russia back in the day in the Soviet Union, or even China right now with its poverty program. So, like, let's just say China. Okay, let's just pretend we all agree that they're not socialist. But, okay, well, they're still eliminating poverty, right? Well, how do we explain that away? I mean, this is like government intervention to the highest extent to like try and get these people out of poverty. It's only with that kind of intervention that will happen. These capitalist states, if they took over, they would just be like, oh, well, we got poor people here, but, we're kind of developing anyway, so who cares about them? We need a surplus population anyways, right? That's capitalism. So I heavily disagree. You would not see the kind of development in China or Russia if it wasn't for socialism. They would be still backwards by standards, but instead, countries that have both gotten right up to where we're at. They both reached the number 2 position as far as like being the largest economy in the world. That just doesn't just happen naturally, like Man in a Wall is trying to argue. That happens with like government intervention. So no, I disagree with that.
Right, and just to wrap things up here, let's keep on moving through the video because it's about to get, we're about to wind down a little bit.
Black Army, CNTFIA, Zapistas Rojava. Also see my comments above. Can I go home now?
All right, so, I mean, you talk about the Black Army, the CNTFA, the Zapatistas, and Rojava. Once again, there's too much to unpack here for this video. I'll be making a video about each of these in the future, but suffice to say, every one of these examples not only shows how ML tactics proved to be more effective, but let's talk briefly about the authoritarian tactics of these movements. We talked previously about the Black Army having forced labor, as did the CNTFA. both of which functioned as a de facto state, even if they insisted that they weren't. Now, as far as the Zapatistas are concerned, they never claim to be anarchists, but rather see themselves as a blend of traditional Mayan culture with anarchism and Marxism. Oh, look at that. They also have murals of Che Guevara, and they idolize him, even though Che was an evil tanky. As far as Rahaba, they're being assisted by the U.S. military, which is funny because that's how you know a Western leftist will support it, only if it gets Uncle Sam's stamp of approval.
Yeah, pretty much. You want to finish up the last little second here, and we'll give our closing remarks.
Allendis Chile would have worked out. So what's my advice? Drop this nonsense. By virtue of advocating for revolution, you are, by definition, authoritarian. At the same time, everything that requires social change is at some level also authoritarian. Calling yourself libertarian won't win you any favors from the ruling class, who hate you as much as they hate me.
So first off, I love how Dankey's accused people like me of using authoritarianism as a buzzword, while in this video, Hakeem somehow both simultaneously defines authoritarianism as entailing socialist revolution and structural violence under capitalism at the same time. Second, the reason that libertarian socialists call themselves libertarian socialists isn't to win favors from the ruling class. It's because our ideas are better than yours and more democratic than
Okay, so the point that Hakeem was trying to make is that no matter how you look at it, authoritarian methods are used in any revolution, whether it be to restore capitalism or to abolish it. And the use of violence is justified when it's for the purpose of working class liberation. The authoritarian nature of socialist revolution is justified because it seeks to liberate the entire working masses against the authoritarianism of capital, which is surely more widespread and inflicted over a much larger portion of the populace. Now, because of its non-material basis, any apparatus of state power can be called authoritarian, but this leaves out an important distinction, that a communist state functions in the interest of the workers, the overwhelming majority of society, while a capitalist state functions in the interest of the capitalist at the expense of the worker. In capitalism, the state is used to crush the workers into submission. In communism, the state is used to crush the capitalists and to free society from their oppression.
Right.
than yours, and we like to distinguish ourselves. Thirdly, as far as the notion that we as actual socialists don't get anything from distancing ourselves from state capitalists like you, again, all I have to do is point to the Sanders campaign as a rebuttal to that. And finally, on the issue of Chile. Next week, I'm going to be talking a lot about Allende, Pinochet, the crimes committed by the latter, and the apologists for those crimes. But let's say for a moment that Allende wasn't the man he was and decided to implement the kind of strategy Hakeem is advocating for. What would, in a purely political praxis and human rights sense, distinguish him from a figure like Pinochet? Violent overthrow of a democratically elected government? Check. An internal security apparatus used to punish political dissent? Check. Means of repression against figures who you deem to be reactionary? Do I even need to say it? Now,
all right, so, I mean, this is just meaningless speculation, as Man on the Wall has no evidence to suggest Allende would have been just as bad as Pinochet. And even to suggest this shows that he doesn't really understand. Allende shows that the path towards building socialism is a precarious one. And if special efforts aren't made to form an armed wing of the Revolutionary Party, the military will be bribed by the CIA to take over your country and form a junta. It's very dishonest to say, look at the horrible things Pinochet did. Allende would have done that too if he had been a tanky. We don't know what Allende would have done because he was forced to commit suicide after being overthrown by a CIA-backed coup. But we do know that Allende identified as a Marxist, not as an anarcho-Bidenist, libertarian, socialist, social democrat like Man on the Wall. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of interesting. So he's saying, what if Allende did everything that Hakeem wanted him to do? Well, he would have been just as bad as Pinochet. Well, what he's pretty much saying is Pinochet is like as bad as Lenin. I mean, if we're going to take that like at its brutally like honest form, I mean, that's kind of the comparison, right? I mean, since Hakeem's a Leninist, he's proposing Leninist tactics. and you're saying, well, that you're just as bad as Pinochet. I mean, yeah, once again, I know like here, Man in the Wall earlier was saying, I don't think you're a fascist, and I don't, all that stuff. But okay, you say we're not fascist, but then you keep comparing us to Pinochet and all these people. And who did he compare you to earlier, Dankey? Steven Crowder?
Yeah, he compared me to Steven Crowder, a guy who harasses gay people. Keep in mind, I've been nothing but supportive of the LGBT community on this channel.
Yeah. And so it's like, these comparisons are just like, kind of dishonest and kind of cringy.
So let's go ahead and finish up the video, and then we can give our closing thoughts, because we're almost approaching the 2-hour, 45-minute mark.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is like a Lord of the Rings movie in terms of length, ladies and gentlemen. The Conquest of Breadtube, more like the Return of the King.
Now, true, the supposed left-wing authoritarian Chilean regime I'm describing and the actual right-wing authoritarian Chilean regime that existed would probably disagree on some economic issues. One would be capitalist and one would pretend to be socialist. There is something of a distinction, even I'll admit. But in terms of the way they strive for and wield state power, they'd be almost identical. And, well, I don't know about you, but that's not what I want socialism to be. I'm Man in the Wall, and I'll see you next time.
Yeah, so, I guess one thing I'll say is, I'm going to butcher the phrase once again, but isn't it like it takes like 5 seconds to tell a bunch of lies and like 5 hours to disprove them? That's kind of what we've been like dealing with here, I guess. But yeah, what's your overall impression, Dankey, from that? Like you said, it was a whole hodgepodge of just like all these history things, and like here it is all in like 1 20-minute video. But once again, I felt like it was lacking a lot of, I don't know, economic arguments, as far as like, he just says that, oh, Pinochet and like a Leninist state are both kind of authoritarian, so they're just as bad. And then he's like, well, one likes capitalism, one likes socialism, so I guess that's different. That's the biggest thing in the world. That's the biggest difference right there. But he's just acting like, oh, that's just like a small thing. I mean, you're not even taking into consideration Pinochet is like supported by the Western imperialists. I mean, these countries are fighting against them. It's just like we feel like we're saying the same things over and over again, but like it just looks very bizarre when you guys like, it's like, okay, we'll tell you this history, and then it's like, you just kind of purposely don't bring those things up. Like, you can make arguments against people and like at least bring up, well, I know there's some evidence that kind of goes against what I'm saying. This is how I deal with that contradiction. But instead, we're just kind of left saying the same things over and over again, it sounds like, because, like, I don't know, you guys don't ever read history.
Right. And I don't know. It's like overall, I found the video to be so grossly misinformed and steeped in radical liberalism that I hesitate to even begin describing everything that I found wrong with it. I mean, the sad thing is, this is exactly what I would have expected from a Vosh fan. If I made a caricature of what a Vosh fan would say, he would say the same exact things that Man in the Wall said, such as Bernie made socialism acceptable in America. Bernie was more successful than any ML. Tankies are bad because they put fascists in re-education camps. Tankies are bad because they have a secret police. You're an idiot. You're a reactionary. You're a fascist authoritarian apologist. You're the Steven Crowder of the left, etc. I mean, I found this video not only to be infantile in the Leninist sense of the word, but completely unoriginal as well. I mean, these are all common rad lib arguments you hear all the time from prominent breadtubers like Vosh and Xanderthal, both of which seem to be worshipped by Man in the Wall. So if there's any advice I can give him as a former anarchist, here it is. Even though you may think that you understand Marxist-Leninist theory, based off of what I've seen in the video, you clearly don't. And I'm sure your understanding of it is limited to only what you've heard spewing out of the mouths of Vosh and Xanderthal and Chomsky. And now maybe it's time to stop watching epic gamer bros playing the video on Twitch telling you to vote Biden and start reading some theory And before you accuse me of saying read theory to avoid making an argument, keep in mind what we've been doing for the past 3 fucking hours. We've been debunking your argument point by point by point. So, I mean, anyway, I'm set to have a debate with this guy this Sunday. We're going to talk about Vosh, and we're going to talk about this video. So I want everybody to stay tuned for that.
Yeah. I'll end on one last little point here. I see Neo Jackaman made a point. He said, Wall Street protests made socialism popular. It made Bernie possible. I see the sentiment you're going for there, comrade. I know me and you talked about this earlier, Dankey. This is something we always say, but yeah, it's not great men who create history, but like for Man on the Wall to just say, well, look, Bernie popped up and like, he's going to make like a more New York Times friendly kind of socialist that like people accept. But like, where did Bernie come from? He didn't come from thin air. It's totally from like the material conditions of like our time period. A Bernie Sanders wouldn't have been possible without like in the earlier decade, the Wall Street protests and all that, Occupy and Black Lives Matter and such. So like Trump was a similar thing. He saw a certain trend developing in society and he said, that's going to be my base. I'm going to appeal to them. And Bernie almost kind of did a similar thing, even though he's like claimed he's been a socialist for a long time. So that's kind of like my something I noticed about his overall argument too. Like he just thinks these great men or great women will come into power and hopefully convince the New York Times and CNN that, oh, I guess socialism, I guess it's not authoritarian. Like, yeah, that's more impossible than a revolution. Like you want to say a revolution's impossible, that's more impossible to me than, workers taking over. But that's my opinion. But hey, Dankey, I see that you got Tommy Wright the Third in your YouTube videos right there. Whenever we close out of here, you should close on that note. That'd be
yeah. Oh yeah, that sounds good to me. So,
but do you have any other comments before we get out of here, comrade?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for listening. We have got a new episode of the Iron Curtain podcast coming out soon. And I am looking forward to putting that out there. It's going to be a good one, folks.
Yeah, definitely, comrades.
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody for staying with me this whole time, and peace out.
See you, comrades. Yeah, this is some real old Memphis shit right here.
Oh yeah. This is real Memphis rap.
Roll back street, smoking a jump with my nigga McT. Out in the back seat, looking for niggas we might want to creep. Riding blazer, rolling through praise. Step to me, and we were squad. Nothing but some born gangsters. Hesitate, can't wait to rob. Nigga be wonder why Tommy be clicking, but sometimes ain't that just the way that I am. If you duck, you still mess up. That ain't gonna help protect yourself. Now it's just you against my gas powder and my braking. Since you shot up this phone corner, this is the last breath you'll take. Now you running through people yard, scared you gon' end up dead, jumping gates, but you can't escape this laser infrared. Spray your ass just like they did Ricky on that Boys in the Hood. Fool, cause I'm coming out the sunroof with some fire. It's a drive-by.